The 16th Legion came into being during the final stages of the Unification Wars, forged in the gene labs beneath the Himalayan peaks, where the Emperor conducted his work on the Astartes project. Their first recruits were drawn from Terran stock, specifically from the techno-barbarian clans that had sworn fealty to the Emperor after their defeat. These weren't the refined warrior aristocracies of other recruitment pools. The 16th took their initiates from the hard-bitten survivors of Terra's most brutal conflicts, men who understood war as a matter of simple mathematics: hit harder, hit faster, and never stop until the enemy breaks. Before their Primarch's discovery, the 16th Legion earned a reputation that made even other Astartes wary. They fought without the tactical sophistication that would later define them, relying instead on concentrated mass and overwhelming aggression. When the 16th deployed, they came as a hammer blow, no feints, no elaborate maneuvers, just the full weight of Legion strength applied to a single point until something gave way. The casualty rates were staggering, both for their enemies and for the Legion itself, but the 16th delivered victories when the Emperor needed worlds brought to compliance quickly and without negotiation. Their early campaigns during the Great Crusade's opening years saw them operating under rotating command structures, as the Emperor had not yet located their gene sire. This created a unique dynamic within the Legion. Without a Primarch to provide identity and purpose, the 16th defined themselves purely through their battlefield performance. They took pride in being the Emperor's blunt instrument, the force he unleashed when subtlety had failed or when a message needed to be sent. Other legions whispered that the 16th were little better than gene-enhanced barbarians, that they wasted Astartes' lives with their crude tactics. But those whispers stopped when the 16th brought entire star systems into compliance, while more sophisticated legions were still conducting reconnaissance. The discovery of Horus on Thonia changed everything. The 16th Legion found their father on a world that seemed purpose-built to produce warriors, a planet where the surface had long ago been stripped away, leaving only the endless warren of hive cities and mining tunnels that burrowed deep into Thonia's crust. Horus had risen from gang enforcer to the ruler of Thonia's most powerful clan, and when the Emperor arrived, he found not a feral child, but a fully formed war leader who commanded the loyalty of an entire world. The reunion transformed the 16th Legion. Horus brought with him not just his tactical genius, but the entire cultural framework of Thonian gang warfare. This wasn't the ritualized combat of knightly orders or the disciplined formations of professional armies. Thonian warfare was personal, brutal, and built on chains of loyalty that ran deeper than any formal command structure. A gang member didn't follow orders because of rank. He fought because his brothers stood beside him, because he owed blood debts to the men who had saved his life, because betraying the gang meant betraying everything that gave his existence meaning. Horus recognized immediately that the Terran recruits who formed the Legion's core had already developed something similar to Thonian gang culture through their shared combat experience. He didn't discard what the 16th had built. Instead, he refined it, gave it structure and purpose. The Legion began recruiting heavily from Thonia, and the new blood brought with them the traditions of the hive gangs. Veterans started wearing their hair in top knots, a Thonian mark of status that indicated a warrior had survived enough battles to earn respect. The longer the top knot, the more kills, the more campaigns, the more scars earned in the service of the Legion. The concept of the warrior lodge took root within the 16th, though in these early days it remained an informal tradition rather than the organized secret societies that would later prove so destructive. Warriors gathered to share stories, to settle disputes, to forge the bonds of brotherhood that made the Legion more than just a military formation. A legionnaire might serve in one company but maintain lodge bonds with warriors scattered throughout the Legion, creating a web of personal relationships that cut across formal hierarchies. When a warrior called on his lodge brothers for aid, they came, regardless of what their officers commanded. This culture of personal loyalty and brotherhood made the 16th Legion devastatingly effective. Where other legions relied on discipline and doctrine, the 16th fought with the cohesion of men who would rather die than let their brothers down. Horus understood this instinctively. He had built his power on Thonia through the same principles, and he shaped the Legion into a weapon that combined Astartes' superiority with the savage loyalty of hive gang warfare. The Legion's doctrine evolved under Horus's command. The crude frontal assaults of their early years gave way to a more sophisticated approach that still emphasized overwhelming force but applied it with precision. Horus taught his sons to identify the critical point in any battle, the command center, the key fortification, the linchpin unit, and then to hit that point with everything they had. The 16th became masters of the decisive strike, the single devastating blow that shattered enemy cohesion and turned organized resistance into panicked rout. The Siege of Archreach Secundus demonstrated this doctrine perfectly. The fortress world had defied Imperial compliance for months, its defense networks and void shields making orbital bombardment ineffective. Other legions might have settled in for a prolonged siege, grinding down the defenses through attrition. Horus identified the central power distribution node that fed the fortress's shield generators, led the assault himself, and had his warriors fighting inside the node facility within 6 hours of making planetfall. The shields collapsed, the fortress fell, and the 16th earned the name Luna Wolves in honor of their Primarch and the pale light of Thonia's moon that had watched over Horus's rise to power. The Luna Wolves developed relationships with other legions that reflected their culture and values. The Death Guard became natural allies. Mortarian's sons shared the Luna Wolves' appreciation for straightforward warfare and their willingness to endure horrific casualties to achieve victory. The two legions fought side by side on dozens of campaigns, and their warriors developed mutual respect born from shared suffering in the worst war zones the Great Crusade could offer. The Emperor's children represented a different kind of brotherhood. Fulgrim's legion pursued perfection in all things, a goal that seemed at odds with the Luna Wolves' pragmatic approach to warfare. Yet Horus and Fulgrim formed a bond that transcended their legion's different philosophies. The Luna Wolves appreciated the Emperor's children's skill and dedication, while Fulgrim's warriors recognized that the Luna Wolves' apparent simplicity concealed sophisticated tactical thinking. When the two legions operated together, they complemented each other perfectly, the Emperor's children providing precision and finesse, the Luna Wolves delivering overwhelming force. The Blood Angels proved another natural ally. Sanguinius and Horus developed a friendship that many considered the closest bond between any of the Primarchs, and their legions reflected that relationship. The Blood Angels brought artistry to warfare, transforming battle into something that approached beauty, while the Luna Wolves brought raw effectiveness. The two legions shared a similar approach to leadership, both valued personal charisma and the bonds between warriors, though they expressed these values in different ways. Blood Angels and Luna Wolves served together on compliance actions across the galaxy, and their warriors frequently exchanged training and tactics. The Luna Wolves maintained more distant relationships with legions whose cultures didn't align with their own values. They respected the martial prowess of various other legions, but found little common ground with warriors who emphasized different aspects of warfare. The Luna Wolves fought for their brothers, and for the glory of victory itself. They struggled to connect with legions driven by other motivations. By the time the Great Crusade reached its height, the Luna Wolves had established themselves as one of the most effective legions in the Imperium's arsenal. They had brought hundreds of worlds into compliance, fought alongside nearly every other legion at one point or another, and earned a reputation as the Emperor's favored sons. Horus himself stood first among the Primarchs, the most charismatic and successful of the Emperor's gene-forged generals. The legion that had begun as brutal shock troops drawn from Terran gang fighters had evolved into a sophisticated military force that combined tactical excellence with unbreakable bonds of brotherhood. Thonia was a world that had consumed itself. The mining operations that had made it prosperous during the dark age of technology had burrowed so deep and extracted so much that the planet's surface had collapsed inward, leaving only a shell of interconnected hive cities and tunnel networks that descended into darkness. The population survived in a state of perpetual gang warfare, fighting over water rights, food shipments, and territory that might contain one more functioning air recycler. Into this environment, one of the Emperor's stolen sons had fallen, and Thonia had shaped him into something remarkable. The Emperor found Horus leading the largest gang confederation Thonia had ever seen. The young Primarch hadn't simply fought his way to the top through brute strength, though he possessed that in abundance. He had built his power base through a combination of personal charisma, strategic thinking, and an instinctive understanding of how to forge loyalty. Horus knew every gang leader in his confederation by name, knew their families, their ambitions, their fears. He settled disputes before they became blood feuds, rewarded loyalty with genuine affection rather than just material benefits, and led from the front in every major engagement. When the Emperor's fleet arrived in orbit, Horus commanded the loyalty of millions not through fear, but through the bonds he had personally forged with the men and women who followed him. The reunion between father and son took place in the depths of Thonia's largest hive complex. The Emperor descended into the warrens where Horus held court, and the Primarch recognized his gene sire immediately. What passed between them in that first meeting remained private, but when they emerged, Horus had pledged himself to the Great Crusade, and everything changed for the 16th Legion. The Emperor granted Horus command of his legion, gave him the name Lupercal in honor of the ancient Terran she-wolf who had nursed the founders of Rome, and set him loose to conquer the galaxy. Horus brought Thonian culture with him to the Legion, but he also brought something more valuable, a leadership philosophy that transformed how the 16th fought and thought about warfare. On Thonia, a gang leader who demanded blind obedience didn't last long. The Hive Warrens were too complex, the tactical situations too fluid for rigid command structures. A good leader explained his plans, listened to input from experienced fighters, and made his warriors feel like partners in victory rather than disposable assets. Horus applied this approach to Legion command, and his warriors responded with fanatical devotion. The Primarch made a point of knowing his officers personally, not just their names and service records, but their personalities, their strengths, their concerns. He walked through the Legion's encampments talking to regular legionaries, asking about their families back on Thonia or Terra, discussing tactical problems as if he genuinely valued their opinions. When Horus gave an order, his warriors understood not just what they were supposed to do, but why it mattered, how their piece fit into the larger plan. This approach created a legion where initiative was encouraged rather than punished, where warriors felt trusted to make decisions in the chaos of combat because they understood their Primarch's intentions. The campaigns that established Horus's reputation as the Emperor's greatest general demonstrated both his tactical genius and his ability to adapt strategy to circumstance. The pacification of the Kava's belt showed the Imperium what Horus could accomplish when given a seemingly impossible task. The belt was a region of space cluttered with asteroid fortresses, pirate bases, and Xenos enclaves that had resisted Imperial compliance for decades. Previous expeditionary fleets had gotten bogged down trying to reduce each stronghold individually, losing ships and men to ambushes launched from the countless hiding places the belt provided. Horus approached the problem differently. He identified the largest and most powerful faction in the belt, a confederation of human renegades who controlled the main trade routes and opened negotiations. His message was simple: join the Imperium willingly and retain your autonomy under Imperial governance, or resist and be destroyed. To demonstrate he meant business, Horus led a lightning strike against the Confederation's most heavily defended fortress, a converted ore processing station that was supposed to be impregnable. The Luna Wolves boarded the station, fought through its defenders in brutal close-quarters combat, and captured the Confederation's leadership in less than 8 hours. The Confederation's leaders surrendered, agreed to Imperial terms, and Horus immediately incorporated their forces into his campaign. With local guides and intelligence, the Luna Wolves swept through the Kava's belt in a matter of months, offering each faction the same choice: compliance or annihilation. Most chose compliance once they saw what had happened to those who resisted. Horus didn't just conquer the belt, he turned its former pirates and renegades into productive Imperial citizens, demonstrating that the Great Crusade wasn't just about destruction, but about building something that could last. The Ulanor Crusade represented the pinnacle of Horus's achievements during the Great Crusade, and the event that would define his relationship with the Emperor and his brother Primarchs. The Orc Empire centered on Ulanor was the largest greenskin threat the Imperium had encountered, a vast realm encompassing hundreds of worlds, and commanded by an orc warlord of unprecedented size and cunning. The Emperor himself took command of the campaign, bringing together multiple Space Marine legions and millions of Imperial Army troops in the largest military operation since the Unification Wars. Horus commanded the spearhead forces, leading the Luna Wolves alongside several other legions in the assault on Ulanor itself. The fighting was apocalyptic in scale, orc hordes numbered in the billions, their war machines covered the planet's surface, and their defenses had been built up over decades of expansion. Horus demonstrated his ability to coordinate multiple legion forces, maintaining cohesion among Primarchs whose tactical doctrines often conflicted. He identified the critical objectives, allocated forces to maximize each legion's strengths, and drove the offensive forward even when casualties mounted into the hundreds of thousands. The final assault on the Warlord's fortress palace required Horus to lead from the front, fighting through kilometers of fortified tunnels packed with the largest and most dangerous orcs the Greenskins could produce. The Luna Wolves took staggering losses, but they broke through to the throne room where the Warlord held court. The Emperor himself killed the Warlord in single combat, but it was Horus's tactical genius that had made that confrontation possible. Without the Luna Wolves' advance, without Horus's coordination of the broader campaign, the Ulanor Crusade might have dragged on for years. The triumph of Ulanor followed the victory, and the Emperor made an announcement that shocked the Imperium. He named Horus as Warmaster, giving him supreme command over all Imperial military forces and authority over his brother Primarchs. The decision reflected the Emperor's assessment of Horus's unique qualifications. No other Primarch combined his military genius with his political acumen and his ability to work with warriors of vastly different temperaments. The Emperor intended to return to Terra to work on projects he considered vital to humanity's future, and he needed someone who could continue the Great Crusade in his absence. The political implications of this choice rippled through the Imperium immediately. Some Primarchs accepted Horus's elevation without reservation. Sanguinius openly supported his brother, as did Fulgrim and several others who had fought alongside Horus and recognized his capabilities. Other Primarchs struggled with the idea of taking orders from one of their own. They were gene-forged demigods, each convinced of his own superiority, and being subordinated to a brother rankled regardless of Horus's achievements. The Emperor had created them to be proud, to be confident in their own judgment, and now he asked them to defer to Horus's authority. Horus navigated these political tensions with the same skill he brought to military campaigns. He understood that he couldn't simply issue orders and expect compliance from warriors who were his equals in every way except title. Instead, he positioned himself as first among equals, a coordinator rather than a dictator. When planning campaigns, Horus consulted with his brother Primarchs, incorporated their input, and made them feel like partners in decision-making. He distributed glory generously, making sure that each Primarch received credit for his legion's achievements rather than claiming all success for himself. This approach worked with most of his brothers, but not all. Some Primarchs remained distant, convinced that the Warmaster's authority represented an insult to their own capabilities. Horus worked harder to win over these skeptics, assigning them prestigious commands, praising their victories, and demonstrating through actions that he valued their contributions. He succeeded more often than he failed, building a coalition of Primarchs who genuinely respected his leadership rather than simply tolerating it because the Emperor had commanded obedience. Horus's philosophy of warfare evolved as his responsibilities expanded beyond commanding a single legion. He believed that the application of overwhelming force, properly applied, could minimize casualties on both sides by ending conflicts quickly. A show of unstoppable power often convinced enemies to surrender without fighting, saving lives that would be wasted in prolonged campaigns. When diplomacy was possible, Horus preferred it, but he made sure potential allies understood that negotiation was backed by the threat of total annihilation if they chose resistance. This philosophy led to some of Horus's most impressive achievements as Warmaster. He brought entire star systems into compliance through negotiation, convincing human civilizations that had maintained independence for millennia that joining the Imperium served their interests better than feudal resistance. The Warmaster demonstrated that the Imperium could offer protection, trade, and cultural exchange rather than just conquest and subjugation. Worlds that might have required years of bloody campaigning to subdue instead welcomed imperial rule after Horus explained the benefits and demonstrated the alternative by destroying a nearby system that had refused his terms. The Luna Wolves, now renamed the Sons of Horus in recognition of their Primarch's elevation to Warmaster, adapted to their new role as the Warmaster's own legion. They became the Imperium's diplomatic vanguard as often as its military spearhead, and Horus trained his warriors to understand politics and negotiation, as well as tactics and combat. A Sons of Horus officer needed to recognize when a show of force would achieve more than actual violence, when offering generous terms would bring compliance faster than threats, when the Imperium's long-term interests required mercy rather than vengeance. This didn't make the Sons of Horus soft. They remain one of the most effective fighting forces in the Imperium, and their combat record spoke for itself. But they developed a sophistication that set them apart from legions that saw every problem as something to be solved through violence. Horus understood that the Great Crusade was supposed to be building an empire, not just conquering territory, and he shaped his legion to support that vision. Horus's vision for the Imperium's future extended beyond the military campaigns that dominated his present. He saw the Great Crusade as a temporary phase, a necessary period of conquest that would eventually give way to peaceful expansion and consolidation. The Warmaster believed that once humanity controlled the galaxy, the Space Marine legions would need to find new purposes. He imagined his warriors as governors and administrators, using their enhanced capabilities to guide human civilization rather than just defending it. The bonds of brotherhood that held the legions together could become the foundation for a new kind of government, one where loyalty and personal relationships mattered as much as formal hierarchies. These ideas remained mostly private, shared with his closest advisors and most trusted brothers, but not widely proclaimed. Horus understood that the Emperor had his own vision for humanity's future, and the Warmaster's role was to execute that vision rather than substitute his own. Still, in quiet moments between campaigns, Horus discussed with Sanguinius and others what might come after the fighting ended, what role the Primarchs and their legions might play in an Imperium at peace. The conversations revealed a man who thought deeply about purpose and meaning, who wanted to believe that all the bloodshed served some greater goal than just endless expansion. The Luna Wolves wore armor of white and green, a color scheme that set them apart from the stark black and white or pure white liveries of other legions. The green represented Thonia's industrial heart, the color of corroded metal and chemical runoff that stained the hive world's depths. The white symbolized the pale lunar surface that hung over Thonia. The moon that gave the legion its name after Horus led them to victory at Arc Reach Secundus. This combination created a distinctive appearance on the battlefield. Luna Wolves' warriors stood out against the gray and brown landscapes of most compliance actions, and their enemies learned to recognize those white and green plates as harbingers of overwhelming force. The Legion's iconography centered on Lupin imagery that carried multiple layers of meaning. The wolf represented loyalty, the pack bond that held the Legion together and made them more than just individual warriors. It also symbolized predatory excellence, the hunting instinct that Horus cultivated in his sons. A wolf didn't waste energy on unnecessary violence, but when it struck, it went for the throat. The Luna Wolves adopted this mentality completely. They studied their enemies, identified weaknesses, and then attacked with devastating precision. The wolf's head that adorned their armor served as both promise and threat. Fight beside us and we're your brothers. Stand against us and we'll tear you apart. The Mournival represented Horus's most significant innovation in Legion command structure. 4 captains, chosen not just for their tactical brilliance, but for their ability to speak truth to their Primarch, formed an advisory body unlike anything in other legions. Ezekiel Abaddon commanded the first company and brought aggressive tactical thinking to the Mournival's discussions. His reputation as a warrior was unmatched even among the Luna Wolves, and his loyalty to Horus bordered on religious devotion. Abaddon saw the Warmaster as the Imperium's future and believed that whatever Horus commanded must be right simply because Horus commanded it. Tarek Torgadon served as the Mournival's voice of humor and perspective. Where Abaddon burned with intensity, Torgadon maintained the ability to laugh at the absurdities of war and remind his brothers that they were still human despite their genetic enhancement. He had fought alongside Horus since the earliest days after the Primarch's discovery, and their relationship allowed Torgadon freedoms that other officers would never dare take. He could mock Horus's decisions, question his reasoning, and do it all with a smile that took the sting out of criticism while still making his point. Horus Aximand, called Little Horus for his remarkable facial resemblance to the Warmaster, brought analytical precision to the Mournival. He approached problems methodically, breaking down complex situations into manageable components and identifying solutions that others might miss. Aximand's resemblance to Horus created a strange dynamic. Some warriors found it unsettling to see what looked like a smaller version of their Primarch, while others saw it as a mark of special favor. Aximand himself seemed uncomfortable with the attention his appearance generated, preferring to let his tactical contributions speak for themselves. Garvil Loken represented the Legion's idealistic core, the warrior who still believed completely in the Great Crusade's stated purpose of bringing enlightenment to humanity. He had risen through the ranks based purely on merit, without the political connections that smoothed advancement for some officers. Loken took the imperial truth seriously, rejecting superstition and irrationality, even when doing so made him seem naive to more cynical brothers. His presence in the Mournival provided a moral compass, a reminder of what the Luna Wolves were supposed to be fighting for beyond just victory and glory. The Mournival's purpose went beyond simple military advice. Horus had created the body to serve as his conscience, a group of warriors who could tell him when they thought he was wrong. The Primarch understood that his position isolated him. Regular officers hesitated to contradict a demigod, and his brother Primarchs had their own agendas that colored their counsel. The Mournival answered only to Horus and to their own sense of duty to the Legion. When they met in private, formality disappeared and Horus could discuss his doubts, his concerns, his questions about the Emperor's plans and the Imperium's future. The four captains argued with each other and with their Primarch, and those arguments helped Horus refine his thinking and avoid mistakes born from isolation. The lodge system that permeated the Luna Wolves had roots in Davonite warrior lodge traditions rather than purely Thonian gang culture, though both influences shaped its development. When the Luna Wolves brought the world of Davon into compliance, they encountered warrior societies that organized themselves into lodges where rank meant nothing and all brothers met as equals. These lodges served social and spiritual functions, providing spaces where warriors could speak freely without the constraints of military hierarchy. Horus saw value in this tradition and encouraged its adoption within the Legion, believing that the cross-rank brotherhood it fostered would strengthen the bonds between his warriors. The lodges spread through the Legion quickly because they fulfilled needs that the formal command structure couldn't address. A sergeant might serve in the same lodge as a captain, and within lodge meetings they were simply brothers. Warriors used lodge gatherings to discuss concerns they couldn't raise through official channels, to seek advice from experienced fighters regardless of their company assignment, to maintain friendships with brothers they had fought beside before transfers separated them. The lodges created a parallel social structure within the Legion, one based on personal relationships rather than military hierarchy. This system had genuine benefits during the Luna Wolves campaigns. Lodge brothers looked out for each other across company lines, sharing intelligence and coordinating actions that formal command channels might not have authorized. When a lodge brother called for support, warriors responded regardless of whether their officers had ordered them to that sector. This informal coordination sometimes achieved results that rigid adherence to battle plans would have missed, and Horus recognized the lodge's value in maintaining Legion cohesion. The secrecy that surrounded lodge activities troubled some officers who didn't participate. Lodge meetings happened behind closed doors, and members swore oaths not to reveal what was discussed. This wasn't unusual for warrior societies, but within a military organization, it created the potential for divided loyalties. A warrior might owe obedience to his captain, but also owe lodge debts to brothers in other companies. Most of the time, these obligations aligned, but the potential for conflict existed. Loken himself initially resisted joining a lodge, uncomfortable with the idea of secret meetings and parallel authority structures, though he eventually accepted membership in the Mournival's Lodge. The lodges would later become vectors for corruption, channels through which doubt and resentment could spread through the Legion faster than official communications. Warriors who might have kept concerns to themselves instead shared them with lodge brothers, and those concerns multiplied as they passed from lodge to lodge. The same bonds of brotherhood that made the lodges valuable during the Great Crusade would make them catastrophically dangerous when those bonds were turned against the Imperium. But during the Luna Wolves' glory days, the lodges seemed like nothing more than a positive tradition that strengthened Legion unity. The first company stood apart from the rest of the Legion in both capability and prestige. Its warriors were veterans of hundreds of campaigns, survivors who had proven themselves in every form of warfare the Great Crusade demanded. The Juster and Terminators formed the first company's elite corps, warriors equipped with tactical dreadnought armor and trained to fight in the most hostile environments the galaxy could produce. Their black Terminator plate, trimmed in the Legion's green, marked them as Horus's chosen instruments for the most critical missions. The Justeran deployed when Horus needed absolute certainty of success. They teleported into fortress cores, boarded enemy flagships, assaulted command centers defended by the enemy's best troops. Their Terminator armor made them nearly unstoppable in close quarters. Bolter rounds that would kill regular Astartes bounced off their thick plates, and their power fists could tear through armored bulkheads. Abaddon led the Justeran personally, and his presence transformed them from merely elite troops into something approaching unstoppable. When the Justeran deployed, the battle was essentially over. Only the casualty count remained in question. The Legion's organization followed the Principia Bellicosa, the comprehensive doctrine that governed Space Marine Legion structure and tactics. The Luna Wolves maintained approximately 25 companies during their height, though the exact number fluctuated based on casualties and recruitment. Each company operated with significant autonomy, commanded by a captain who had earned his position through demonstrated ability rather than political connections. Horus encouraged his captains to develop their own tactical specialties while maintaining the core Luna Wolves' doctrine of decisive strikes and overwhelming force. The second company under Captain Torgeddon specialized in urban warfare, having spent years fighting through hive cities and fortress complexes. The fifth company developed expertise in void warfare and boarding actions. The 10th company became known for rapid deployment operations, hitting targets before enemies realized the Luna Wolves had arrived in system. This specialization allowed Horus to tailor his forces to specific mission requirements while maintaining the flexibility to reorganize companies as situations demanded. Support elements within the Legion included tech marines who maintained the vast array of equipment required to keep a Space Marine Legion operational, apothecaries who tended to wounded warriors and harvested gene seed from the fallen, and chaplains who maintained the Legion's morale and spiritual health. The Luna Wolves placed particular emphasis on their apothecarium, understanding that preserving gene seed meant preserving the Legion's future. Every fallen warrior represented not just a loss of combat power, but the potential loss of future generations if his gene seed couldn't be recovered. The Legion's fleet included dozens of capital ships, with the Vengeful Spirit serving as Horus's flagship. The massive battleship had been designed to accommodate not just a Legion's combat elements, but also the administrative apparatus required to coordinate multi-Legion campaigns. As Warmaster, Horus commanded forces that dwarfed any single Legion, and the Vengeful Spirit became the nerve center for operations spanning entire segmentums. The ship's stratagem could accommodate dozens of senior officers simultaneously. Its communications arrays could coordinate with fleets scattered across light years, and its magazines held enough ammunition to support sustained campaigns without resupply. The 63rd Expedition had first encountered Davin decades before the events that would doom the Warmaster. The world sat in a system far from the major transit routes that carried the bulk of Imperial commerce, a planet where human civilization had regressed to a pre-industrial state after being cut off during Old Night. The indigenous population had organized themselves into warrior societies that fought constant wars over territory and resources. but they retained enough cultural memory of advanced technology to recognize the Imperium's ships as something beyond their current capabilities. Horus had led the compliance action personally, and the campaign demonstrated his preference for diplomacy over unnecessary bloodshed. The warrior societies of Davin respected strength above all else, so Horus gave them a demonstration. The Luna Wolves deployed in force, their white and green armor gleaming under Davin's sun as they marched in perfect formation across the plains where Davinite armies had fought for generations. The display of discipline and power impressed the tribal leaders, but what truly won them over was Horus himself. The Primarch met with the leaders of the largest warrior societies, spoke to them as equals rather than conquered subjects, and explained what the Imperium offered: protection from external threats, access to technology that could improve their lives, and a place in humanity's galactic civilization. The Davinites swore compliance without significant resistance. They recognized that fighting the Imperium would accomplish nothing except their own destruction, and Horus's respectful treatment convinced them that Imperial rule wouldn't mean the end of their warrior culture. The Luna Wolves established a garrison to oversee the transition to Imperial governance, and officers rotated through Davin as part of their training, learning about the local customs and building relationships with the warrior societies. These connections ran deep. Luna Wolves officers adopted aspects of Davinite culture, particularly the warrior lodge traditions that seemed to mirror Thonian gang practices. Yugen Temba had commanded the Imperial garrison on Davin after the initial compliance. He was a capable officer, loyal to Horus personally, and he understood the Davinites well enough to maintain order without heavy-handed enforcement. The Luna Wolves trusted him completely, which made his later betrayal so devastating. Temba had been corrupted slowly, exposed to influences on Davin's moon that twisted his loyalty and turned him into something monstrous. By the time the 63rd expedition returned to the Davin system, Temba had become a servant of powers that the Imperium officially denied existed. The distress signal that brought the expedition back to Davin reported that Temba had seized control of the moon and was using it as a base for raids against Imperial shipping. Horus took the report seriously because Temba's betrayal made no sense. The man had no reason to turn renegade, no grievances that might explain such a dramatic change in behavior. The Warmaster decided to handle the situation personally, both because Temba had been his officer and because the betrayal of an Imperial commander required a response that demonstrated the consequences of breaking faith with the Imperium. The moon of Davin was a desolate place, its surface pocked with ancient ruins that predated human settlement of the system. These ruins had been there when the first colonists arrived during the Dark Age of technology, and the Davinites had developed superstitions about them, believing they were cursed places where evil spirits dwelt. The Imperium's initial survey teams had noted the ruins, but found nothing that warranted detailed investigation, just empty stone structures that showed no signs of advanced technology or valuable resources. Horus led the assault on Temba's position with elements of several companies, including members of the Mournival. The fighting started normally enough. Temba's forces resisted with the skill expected of former Imperial troops, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. The Luna Wolves pushed through the outer defenses and began clearing the ruins where Temba had established his command center. Then the situation changed in ways that violated everything the Luna Wolves understood about reality. The ruins themselves seemed to resist the Luna Wolves' advance. Corridors twisted in directions that shouldn't exist, leading warriors in circles despite their certainty they were moving forward. Temperature fluctuated wildly, going from freezing cold to suffocating heat within seconds. Some warriors reported seeing things moving in the shadows, figures that disappeared when directly observed. The Luna Wolves had fought in every environment the galaxy offered, but this was different. The ruins felt wrong in ways that had nothing to do with tactical disadvantages or environmental hazards. Temba himself had changed into something barely recognizable as human. When Horus finally confronted his former officer, he found a bloated creature whose flesh had swollen grotesquely, whose eyes burned with an intelligence that wasn't entirely Temba's own. The thing that had been Temba wielded a weapon that the Luna Wolves would later learn was called an anatheme, a ritual blade specifically created to kill a Primarch. Such a weapon shouldn't exist. Primarchs were supposed to be nearly invincible, protected by genetic engineering that made them resistant to poisons, diseases, and conventional weapons. But the anatheme had been forged through processes that drew on powers the Imperium claimed were mere superstition. The fight between Horus and Temba lasted only moments. The Warmaster was faster, stronger, and infinitely more skilled than his corrupted former officer. But Temba managed a single strike, driving the anatheme into Horus's shoulder before the Primarch killed him. The wound should have been trivial. Primarchs had survived injuries that would kill regular Astartes instantly, and a shoulder wound was nothing that wouldn't heal within hours. Horus pulled the blade free, crushed Temba's skull with his power claw, and ordered the withdrawal from the ruins. The poison worked quickly. By the time the Luna Wolves returned to their ships, Horus was weakening visibly. His enhanced metabolism, which should have purged any toxin, instead seemed to spread the contamination faster through his system. The Warmaster's skin turned gray, his breathing became labored, and he collapsed into unconsciousness despite the best efforts of the Legion's apothecaries. The medical staff aboard the Vengeful Spirit had no idea how to treat him. Their equipment showed that something was attacking Horus at a cellular level, but they couldn't identify what it was or how to stop it. The Luna Wolves faced a crisis that their training and experience hadn't prepared them for. Their Primarch, the Warmaster of the entire Imperium, lay dying, and none of their advanced medical technology could save him. Abaddon raged at the apothecaries, demanding they do something, anything, while Loken and the other Mournival members struggled to maintain order among warriors who were watching their father slip away. The desperation spread through the Legion like the poison spreading through Horus's body. These were warriors who had conquered worlds, who feared nothing the galaxy could throw at them, and they were helpless to save the one person who mattered most. First Chaplain Erebus of the Word-Bearers Legion had been attached to the 63rd Expedition as an advisor, part of the exchange programs that rotated officers between legions to share tactical knowledge and build inter-legion cooperation. Erebus had cultivated relationships with several Luna Wolves officers, particularly those involved in the warrior lodges, and he had studied Davanite culture extensively during previous visits to the system. When the crisis with Horus reached its peak, Erebus suggested a solution that the desperate Luna Wolves seized upon without adequate consideration of the implications. The Davanites maintained temples dedicated to their old gods, structures where their priests performed healing rituals that supposedly drew on spiritual powers. The largest of these was the Serpent Lodge's Temple, a complex built into the side of a mountain on Davin's primary continent. Erebus explained that the Davanite priests had knowledge of poisons and their cures that went beyond conventional medicine, that they might be able to treat whatever was killing Horus when Imperial technology had failed. The suggestion violated everything the Imperial truth stood for. The Imperium denied the existence of gods and spirits, rejected superstition and religious thinking as remnants of humanity's ignorant past. But the Luna Wolves were watching their Primarch die, and Erebus's suggestion offered hope when they had none. The decision to take Horus to the Serpent Lodge's temple was made by officers who convinced themselves they were simply trying an alternative medical approach. They rationalized that the Davanite priests might know about local toxins that Imperial medicine hadn't cataloged, that their rituals were probably just primitive chemistry that happened to work despite the superstitious trappings. Loken objected, arguing that exposing the Warmaster to whatever went on in those temples was too dangerous, but he was overruled by officers who outranked him, and by the simple fact that doing nothing meant watching Horus die. The temple itself was a massive structure, its walls covered in carvings that depicted serpents intertwined with human figures. The interior was lit by torches that burned with flames that shifted through colors no natural fire should produce. The Davanite priests who maintained the temple wore robes, marked with symbols that made Luna Wolves' warriors uncomfortable in ways they couldn't articulate. Everything about the place contradicted the rational, scientific worldview the Imperium promoted, but the Luna Wolves were beyond caring about ideological consistency. Erebus orchestrated the ritual that followed with the skill of someone who had planned every detail in advance. The priests laid Horus on an altar at the temple's heart, surrounded him with braziers burning substances that filled the air with acrid smoke, and began chanting in languages that predated human settlement of Davin. The Luna Wolves who witnessed the ritual would later struggle to describe what happened. The smoke seemed to take on shapes that moved with purpose. The temperature dropped until frost formed on their armor, and sounds echoed through the temple that couldn't be coming from the priest's chanting. Horus convulsed on the altar, his body arching as if something was being pulled out of him or pushed into him, and then he went completely still. The Warmaster's consciousness had departed his body and entered the warp, though the Luna Wolves watching had no framework to understand what was happening. In the Imperium, Horus experienced visions that the Chaos Gods had carefully crafted to exploit his doubts, his ambitions, and his love for his sons. The entities that humans would eventually call the Ruinous Powers had been watching Horus for years, studying him, waiting for an opportunity to turn the Imperium's greatest general into their instrument. The anatheme had been the bait, and the ritual in the Serpent Lodge's temple had sprung the trap. The visions showed Horus a future where the Emperor had abandoned the Great Crusade and returned to Terra to pursue projects he kept secret from his sons. This much was true. The Emperor had indeed withdrawn from active campaigning and was working on the Webway project, though he hadn't explained his reasons to the Primarchs. The visions twisted this truth, suggesting that the Emperor had only ever seen the Primarchs and their legions as tools to be discarded once they had served their purpose. Horus saw images of Space Marines being systematically eliminated, their legions disbanded, their warriors forced into servitude or simply executed as no longer necessary. The visions showed Horus what would become of his brothers, the Primarchs he had fought beside and led as Warmaster. He saw Angron dying slowly, the butcher's nails that had been implanted in his brain finally killing him while the Emperor did nothing to save him. He saw Magnus brought low, punished for seeking knowledge that the Emperor himself possessed. He saw his closest brothers, Sanguinius, Fulgrim Mortarion, cast aside once they had outlived their usefulness. The visions were lies built on foundations of truth, distortions that took real grievances and magnified them into justifications for betrayal. The imperial truth itself became a weapon in the Chaos Gods argument. The Imperium claimed there were no gods, no supernatural forces, that everything could be explained through science and reason. Yet Horus stood in the warp, experiencing powers that science couldn't explain, confronting entities that called themselves gods and demonstrated capabilities that matched their claims. The hypocrisy was obvious. The Emperor had built his Imperium on a lie, denying the existence of powers he knew were real, leaving humanity vulnerable to threats he refused to acknowledge. Horus had spent decades enforcing the imperial truth, suppressing religious thinking wherever he found it, and now he discovered that the foundation of everything he had fought for was false. The Chaos Gods presented themselves as offering truth where the Emperor had offered lies. They acknowledged what they were, made no pretense about their nature or their goals. They offered Horus power to protect his sons, to ensure that the Space Marines wouldn't be cast aside once the Great Crusade ended. They showed him a path where he could take control of the Imperium, could build the future he had imagined in his private conversations with Sanguinius and others. All he had to do was accept their patronage and turn against the Emperor, who had already betrayed him through deception and manipulation. The corruption worked because it aligned with concerns Horus had genuinely felt. He had worried about what would happen to the legions after the fighting ended, had questioned why the Emperor kept secrets from his sons, had struggled with the contradictions inherent in the imperial truth. The visions didn't plant new doubts. They took existing concerns and twisted them into justifications for actions that Horus would never have contemplated without the Chaos God's influence. The Warmaster's love for his sons, his greatest strength, became the lever that turned him against everything he had fought to build. When Horus awakened in the Serpent Lodge's temple, the poison was gone from his body, but something far worse had taken its place. The Warmaster rose from the altar appearing healthy, his wounds healed, his strength restored. The Luna Wolves who had kept vigil rejoiced, believing their Primarch had been saved. They didn't recognize that the being who stood before them was no longer entirely the Horus they had followed. The corruption had taken root deep in his soul, and while he maintained the appearance of the Warmaster they knew, his thoughts now bent toward treachery that would tear the Imperium apart. Erebus watched his work come to fruition with satisfaction hidden behind a mask of concern for the Warmaster's health. The Word-Bearer had spent years preparing for this moment, building relationships within the Luna Wolves, studying Davanite culture, positioning himself to guide events when the opportunity arose. The warrior lodges he had helped spread through the legions would become channels for the corruption to spread. The bonds of brotherhood that made the Luna Wolves so effective would become chains that dragged them into damnation alongside their Primarch. The change in the Legion began subtly, masked by the relief that swept through the Sons of Horus when their Primarch recovered from his wounds. Horus emerged from the Serpent Lodge's temple appearing stronger than before, his movements confident, his voice commanding. He resumed his duties as Warmaster with an energy that suggested the brush with death had only sharpened his focus. The warriors who had feared losing their father celebrated his return, never suspecting that something fundamental had shifted behind his eyes. The corruption that had taken root during his time in the warp remained invisible to those who lacked the knowledge to recognize it, and the Sons of Horus had been taught by the imperial truth to dismiss the very concept of spiritual contamination as superstitious nonsense. The renaming of the Legion from Luna Wolves to Sons of Horus had occurred before Davin, a change that reflected the Warmaster's elevation and the Legion's pride in their Primarch's achievements. The new name carried weight. These warriors weren't just the Emperor's wolves anymore. They were Horus's sons, bound to him by ties that went beyond simple military hierarchy. The change had been received with enthusiasm throughout the Legion, though some veterans mourned the loss of the Luna Wolves' name and the traditions it represented. Now, in the aftermath of Davin, the new name took on darker significance. The Sons of Horus belonged to their Primarch first and the Imperium second, and when Horus's loyalty shifted, that hierarchy would doom them. The Legion's appearance began to change as well. The white and green armor that had marked the Luna Wolves gave way to a darker palette dominated by sea green, the color of deep ocean water, where light barely penetrates. The change happened gradually, companies repainting their armor as they rotated through the vengeful spirit for resupply and maintenance. Officers explained the shift as a practical decision. The bright white plates that had served well during the Great Crusade's glory days made poor camouflage, and the darker green would serve better in the grinding campaigns that lay ahead. Some warriors embraced the change enthusiastically, seeing it as a break with the past and an embrace of the Legion's future. Others felt uncomfortable with how the new colors seemed to reflect a darker mood spreading through the ranks, though they kept such concerns private. The iconography evolved alongside the color scheme. The wolf's head that had adorned Luna Wolves' armor became more stylized, more aggressive in its depiction. The eye that represented Horus's all-seeing command took on prominence, appearing on shoulder plates and banners throughout the Legion. These changes seemed minor individually, but collectively they represented the death of the old Legion and the birth of something new. The Luna Wolves had been the Emperor's instrument, warriors who fought for the Imperium's vision of unified humanity. The Sons of Horus were becoming something else, an army whose loyalty centered on a single individual rather than the broader imperial project. Horus began coordinating with his brother Primarchs in ways that seemed unremarkable at first. The Warmaster had always maintained close relationships with Fulgrim, Mortarion, and Angron, and his continued communication with them raised no suspicions among the broader imperial command structure. What the Imperium didn't recognize was that these conversations now carried a different purpose. Horus was carefully probing his brothers, assessing their loyalty to the Emperor, identifying grievances that could be exploited. He found fertile ground. Each of these Primarchs harbored resentments that the Emperor's policies had created or exacerbated. Fulgrim and the Emperor's children had pursued perfection for decades, driving themselves to ever greater heights of achievement in service to the Imperium. Yet the Emperor had never acknowledged their efforts as sufficient, never praised them as the finest legion despite their obvious superiority in skill and discipline. The Emperor's children felt unappreciated, their dedication taken for granted, while other legions received recognition for accomplishments that paled beside their own. Horus understood this resentment intimately and knew how to nurture it into something that could be turned against the Imperium. Mortarion's grievances ran deeper and more personal. The Death Guard's Primarch had been raised on Barbarus, a world where human populations cowered in valleys while alien overlords ruled from the poisonous peaks. Mortarion had led a rebellion against these tyrants, had nearly succeeded in killing his adoptive father and freeing his people. When the Emperor arrived and completed the task Mortarion had spent his life preparing for. The Emperor had stolen Mortarion's victory, had robbed him of the vengeance he had earned through years of suffering and struggle. Then the Emperor had demanded Mortarion's service, had taken him from Barbarus and set him to conquering the galaxy for an Imperium the Death Guard's Primarch had never chosen to serve. Mortarion obeyed because he had no alternative, but the resentment festered beneath his compliance. Angron's situation was even more tragic. The World Eater's Primarch had been enslaved as a gladiator, had led a slave rebellion that should have ended in glorious death alongside his brothers and sisters in bondage. The Emperor had teleported Angron away from the final battle, had saved his life while leaving his fellow rebels to die without him. Then the Emperor had done nothing to remove the Butcher's nails, the crude neural implants that had been hammered into Angron's skull and were slowly killing him while driving him into states of mindless rage. The World Eaters had adopted the nails themselves in an attempt to understand their Primarch's suffering, and now an entire legion was descending into the same madness that consumed Angron. The Emperor watched this happen and offered no solutions, no help, no acknowledgement that he bore any responsibility for his son's condition. Horus worked on these grievances carefully, never pushing too hard, always positioning himself as a sympathetic brother who understood their pain. He shared his own doubts about the Emperor's plans, revealed carefully selected pieces of what he had learned in his visions, and watched as his brother's resentment grew into something that could be shaped into active rebellion. The process took months, conversations spread across dozens of meetings and communications, but Horus had time and patience. The Warmaster was building a coalition that could challenge the Imperium itself, and such work couldn't be rushed. The planning for what would become the Isstvan III atrocity began during these conversations. Horus recognized that any rebellion against the Emperor would require eliminating loyalist elements within the legions he was turning to his cause. The Sons of Horus, the Emperor's children, the Death Guard, and the World Eaters all contained warriors who would never betray their oaths to the Imperium, officers and line troops whose loyalty to the Emperor ran deeper than their bonds to their Primarchs. These loyalists would have to be removed before the rebellion could begin in earnest, and their elimination would need to be absolute. Leaving survivors would mean leaving witnesses who could warn the Imperium about what was coming. The identification of loyalist elements within the four legions proceeded through the warrior lodges that had spread through the legions during the Great Crusade. The lodges had always maintained membership rolls, records of which warriors belonged to which groups, and these records now became death lists. Officers who had never joined lodges, who had expressed discomfort with the secret meetings and parallel authority structures, found themselves marked as potential loyalists. Warriors who spoke too enthusiastically about the imperial truth, who maintained close relationships with legions that Horus hadn't approached about joining his rebellion, went on the lists. The process wasn't perfect. Some loyalists belonged to lodges and some traitors had never joined, but it provided a starting framework for identifying who would die on Isstvan III. Garvil Loken represented exactly the kind of officer who couldn't be allowed to survive. His idealism, his genuine belief in the Great Crusade's purpose, his uncomfortable questions about the changes he saw in the Legion, all of these marked him as someone who would resist when the rebellion began. Loken had been part of the Mournival, had stood close enough to Horus to see the changes in his Primarch, and his concerns were already causing problems. He questioned orders, challenged decisions, and maintained relationships with officers from other legions who might listen if he raised alarms about what was happening within the Sons of Horus. Loken had to die, and his death needed to look like something other than assassination. Tarek Torgadon's fate was more complex. He had been Horus's friend since the earliest days after the Primarch's discovery, and his loyalty to Horus personally was absolute. But Torgadon retained the independence of thought that had made him valuable as part of the Mournival, and that independence made him dangerous. He might follow Horus into rebellion, or he might recognize that the Warmaster had been corrupted by something beyond simple ambition. The uncertainty meant Torgadon couldn't be trusted with knowledge of the planned betrayal, and warriors who couldn't be trusted had to be eliminated. Thousands of other names went on the lists across the 4 legions. Captains who had served with distinction for decades, sergeants who had earned their rank through demonstrated loyalty to the Imperium, even regular line troops whose commitment to the imperial truth seemed too strong to be overcome. The scale of what Horus was planning became clear through these lists. He wasn't just removing a few problematic officers, he was purging entire companies of warriors whose only crime was remaining loyal to the oaths they had sworn when they became Space Marines. Isstvan III was selected as the site for the purge with cold calculation. The planet had rebelled against imperial rule, its government declaring independence and fortifying the capital city against retaliation. The rebellion needed to be crushed, and the operation provided perfect cover for what Horus intended. 4 legions would deploy to bring Isstvan III back into compliance, and in the process, the loyalist elements within those legions would be eliminated. The survivors, if any, would be too few and too scattered to warn the Imperium about the larger rebellion that was about to begin. The Life Eater virus represented technology that the Imperium possessed but rarely deployed due to its horrific effects. The weapon was biological rather than conventional, an engineered pathogen that attacked living tissue with supernatural efficiency. Organisms infected with Life Eater died within minutes as the virus consumed them from within, breaking down cellular structures and converting biomass into a volatile compound. When enough of this compound accumulated, it ignited, creating firestorms that consumed everything the initial virus release had missed. Life Eater was designed for extermination, for situations where the Imperium wanted to render a world completely lifeless before resettlement. The decision to use Life Eater on Isstvan III was presented as a tactical necessity. The planet's capital was heavily fortified, its population numerous and well-armed, and a conventional ground campaign would take months and cost thousands of Space Marine lives. A virus bombing would eliminate the rebel leadership and military forces instantly, leaving the planet ready for rapid recolonization by loyal Imperial citizens. The logic seemed sound enough that officers who weren't part of the conspiracy accepted it without excessive questioning. The Imperium had used Life Eater before when facing similar situations, and the weapon's deployment didn't automatically signal anything unusual. What made Isstvan III different was the timing. Horus ordered the loyalist elements of all 4 legions to deploy to the surface before the virus bombing, ostensibly to secure key strategic positions and prepare for the main assault. The orders seemed routine. Space Marines had conducted similar preliminary operations on countless worlds during the Great Crusade. The warriors selected for the initial deployment had no reason to suspect they were being sent to die. They boarded their drop pods and Thunderhawks believing they were about to fight another compliance action, another step in the Great Crusade that had defined their existence since their creation. Loken led elements of the Sons of Horus 10th Company to the surface, along with detachments from other companies that Horus had marked for elimination. They deployed into the capital city's outskirts and began their advance toward the primary government complex. The resistance was fiercer than initial intelligence had suggested. Isstvan III's rebels had been preparing for Imperial retaliation and had fortified their positions extensively. The fighting was brutal, close-quarters combat through urban terrain where every building might hide enemy troops and every intersection could become a killing ground. The Sons of Horus fought with their characteristic efficiency, pushing through the rebel defenses despite heavy resistance. Loken coordinated his forces with the skill that had earned him his position in the Mournival, adapting to changing tactical situations and maintaining momentum even as casualties mounted. He had no idea that above him in orbit, the fleet was preparing to murder him and every warrior fighting alongside him. The betrayal was so enormous, so complete, that the concept simply didn't occur to him. Primarchs didn't kill their own sons. The Warmaster didn't betray the Imperium. These truths were so fundamental that questioning them seemed absurd. The virus bombing began without warning. Torpedo tubes on ships throughout the fleet opened and launched their payloads toward Isstvan III's surface. The warheads descended through the atmosphere and detonated at optimal altitude, releasing clouds of Life Eater virus that spread across the planet's surface. The pathogen worked exactly as designed, infecting every living thing it touched. Humans died first, their bodies consumed from within as the virus replicated through their tissues. Plants withered and dissolved. Animals collapsed mid-stride as their cellular structures broke down. Within minutes, billions of lives ended as the Life Eater converted the planet's biosphere into fuel for the coming firestorm. The Space Marines on the surface had slightly more time than the unaugmented humans around them. Their enhanced physiology resisted the virus longer, their multiple redundant organs and sophisticated immune systems fighting against the infection. But Life Eater had been designed to kill everything, including Astartes, and their resistance only delayed the inevitable. Warriors felt the virus attacking them, felt their bodies beginning to fail despite their genetic engineering. Some managed to seal their armor's environmental systems in time, creating temporary protection against the pathogen. Others weren't fast enough and died screaming as their enhanced bodies betrayed them. The firestorm followed the initial die-off as the volatile compounds created by Life Eater's consumption of biomass reached critical concentration. Flames erupted across Isstvan III's surface, hurricane force winds feeding fires that reached temperatures hot enough to melt armor plate. The capital city became an inferno, buildings collapsing as their foundations weakened, streets turning into rivers of molten material. The few Space Marines who had survived the initial virus release now faced a second threat that was just as deadly. Warriors in sealed armor found themselves trapped in environments where the external temperature exceeded their suit's cooling capacity. Some burned to death inside their armor. Others suffocated as their air supplies ran out and they couldn't risk opening their helmets to the toxic atmosphere outside, but some survived. The number was small, perhaps a third of the loyalist forces that had deployed to Isstvan III's surface, but it was enough. Warriors who had sealed their armor in time, who had found shelter in deep bunkers or fortified positions that protected them from the worst of the firestorm, emerged from the bombardment alive and furious. They had watched their brothers die, had seen the fleet that was supposed to support them commit genocide against the very warriors it had deployed. The betrayal was so complete, so absolute, that it shattered every assumption these loyalists had held about their legions and their primarchs. Loken survived through a combination of quick thinking and luck. He had been inside a fortified command bunker when the virus bombing began, coordinating the assault on the government complex with other officers. The bunker's blast doors sealed automatically when atmospheric sensors detected the Life Eater, and the facility's independent air supply kept the virus out. Loken and the warriors with him survived the initial release, but they were trapped as the firestorm raged outside. They listened to the Vox channels fill with screams as their brothers died, heard the static that marked armor breaches and suit failures, and understood with growing horror what had happened. The Warmaster had tried to kill them. Their own Primarch had ordered their execution. The survivors of Isstvan III had bought the Imperium time it desperately needed, though they didn't know it. Their refusal to die quickly forced Horus to commit forces to a prolonged ground campaign, delaying his plans and giving the scattered loyalist elements a chance to send warnings back to Terra. The distress signals that escaped Isstvan III before the traitors could establish a complete communications blockade carried fragmentary reports of betrayal, of Space Marines firing on their own brothers, of Primarchs turning against the Emperor. The Imperium's command structure initially dismissed these reports as impossible. The idea that a Warmaster would rebel, that entire legions would turn traitor, violated every assumption about how the Great Crusade functioned. But the evidence kept accumulating, and eventually even the most skeptical Imperial commanders had to accept the horrifying truth. The Emperor dispatched 7 legions to Isstvan V to crush the rebellion before it could spread beyond the system. The Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard would form the first wave, hitting the traitor positions with overwhelming force, while the Iron Warriors, Night Lords, Alpha Legion, and Word-Bearers followed as reinforcements to complete the destruction of the rebel forces. It was the largest Space Marine deployment since Ulaner, and the Imperium's leadership believed it would end the rebellion decisively. They had no idea that 4 of the 7 legions they were sending had already pledged themselves to Horus. The corruption of Perturabo and the Iron Warriors had been methodical, built on decades of resentment that the Emperor and his administrators had either ignored or actively encouraged. The Iron Warriors had served as the Imperium's siege specialists, the Legion called upon when fortifications needed to be reduced and cities needed to be taken regardless of the cost. They had suffered casualty rates that would have broken other legions, had ground through campaigns that offered no glory and little recognition, and had watched as other legions received praise for victories that cost a fraction of what the Iron Warriors sacrificed in every major operation. Perdurabo's bitterness had been growing since before he was even found by the Emperor, and Horus had recognized how easily that bitterness could be turned into active rebellion. The Iron Warriors would betray the Imperium not because they loved Horus, but because they hated what the Imperium had done to them. The Night Lords brought a different kind of corruption to the conspiracy. Konrad Curze and his Legion had always operated on the edge of what the Imperium considered acceptable, using terror tactics and brutal reprisals to enforce compliance. The Night Lords skinned populations alive, decorated conquered cities with the corpses of rebels, and made examples so horrific that entire sectors surrendered rather than face them. The Imperium had tolerated this because the Night Lords delivered results, but Curze had recognized the hypocrisy. The Emperor claimed to be building an enlightened civilization, while employing warriors who used methods that would have been considered war crimes in any previous age. When Horus approached Curze about joining the rebellion, the Night Haunter saw it as an opportunity to expose the Imperium's moral bankruptcy and prove that the entire Great Crusade had been built on lies and violence. The Alpha Legion's involvement was the most complex and would remain the most mysterious even after the heresy concluded. Alfarius Omgon and their legion specialized in infiltration, misdirection, and operations where the truth was deliberately obscured. The Alpha Legion had agents embedded throughout the Imperium, networks of informants and operatives that gave them intelligence capabilities no other legion could match. When they joined Horus's rebellion, they brought with them the ability to sabotage loyalist operations, spread disinformation, and create chaos behind enemy lines. Whether they truly believed in Horus's cause or were pursuing some deeper agenda known only to the twin Primarchs remained unclear, but their participation in the Isstvan V conspiracy was absolute. The word-bearers had been corrupted longest and most completely. Lorgar and his legion had discovered the Chaos Gods decades before the heresy began, had spent years worshipping the ruinous powers and spreading their influence throughout the Imperium. Erebus and other word-bearers' chaplains had been instrumental in establishing the warrior lodges that now served as vectors for corruption across multiple legions. The word-bearers didn't just support Horus's rebellion, they saw it as the opening move in a religious war that would transform the Imperium into an empire dedicated to chaos worship. Their zealotry made them the most committed of the traitor forces, warriors who believed they were fighting for divine powers rather than just political change. The strategic preparation for Isstvan V required coordinating 8 legions across a campaign that would determine the heresy's outcome. Horus positioned his forces on the planet's surface in what appeared to be defensive positions, fortifying the areas around the main landing zones and preparing to resist the loyalist assault. The Sons of Horus held the central sector, supported by elements of the World Eaters, Emperor's Children, and Death Guard. The traitor forces appeared to be preparing for a desperate last stand, exactly what the loyalists expected from rebels who knew they were facing overwhelming force. Ferrus Manus commanded the loyalist assault, and his approach reflected both his legion's character and his personal fury at the betrayal. The Iron Hands Primarch had been close to Fulgrim, had considered the Emperor's Children's Primarch a true brother, and the revelation that Fulgrim had joined Horus's rebellion had hit Ferrus like a physical blow. He wanted to confront Fulgrim personally, to either bring his brother back to the Imperium's service or kill him for his treachery. This emotional investment in the campaign would prove catastrophic, clouding Ferrus's normally sound tactical judgment and leading him to make decisions that a more detached commander would have avoided. Vulcan of the Salamanders and Korax of the Raven Guard served as Ferrus's primary subordinates, and both Primarchs had concerns about the operational plan. The deployment called for the 3 Loyalist legions to make planetfall simultaneously across multiple drop zones, establishing beachheads before linking up to assault the traitor positions. The plan assumed the traitors would fight a conventional defensive battle, trying to hold their positions against superior numbers until they were overwhelmed. Corax in particular questioned this assumption. The Raven Guard specialized in unconventional warfare, and their Primarch recognized that Horus was too skilled a commander to simply wait for defeat. But Ferrus overruled these concerns, driven by his need to bring the traitors to battle quickly and decisively. The initial assault began with a massive orbital bombardment that targeted the traitor positions. The Loyalist fleet unleashed enough firepower to level cities, turning the landing zones into cratered wastelands where nothing should have survived. The bombardment served both tactical and psychological purposes. It was supposed to weaken the traitor defenses while demonstrating the overwhelming force the Imperium could bring to bear against rebels. The traitors weathered the bombardment in hardened bunkers and underground facilities, taking casualties but maintaining their combat effectiveness. When the bombardment lifted and the Loyalist drop pods began their descent, the traitors were ready. The Iron Hands hit the northern landing zones in a deployment that emphasized their preference for mechanized warfare. Ferrus Manus led from the front, his Terminator armored veterans forming a spearhead that would drive directly into the traitor lines. The Salamanders landed to the south, Vulcan's warriors deploying with the heavy weapons and flame-based armaments that defined their combat doctrine. The Raven Guard took the eastern zones, Corax positioning his legion to exploit any gaps in the traitor defenses and strike at vulnerable command elements. The deployment was textbook Space Marine doctrine, the kind of coordinated assault that had brought thousands of worlds into compliance during the Great Crusade. The traitors responded with a defense that seemed desperate and disorganized. Units fell back from their prepared positions as the Loyalists advanced, giving ground faster than the tactical situation required. The Sons of Horus withdrew from key strongpoints, abandoning fortifications that could have held for days. The World Eaters fought with their characteristic savagery, but couldn't maintain cohesion against the Loyalist advance. The Emperor's Children and Death Guard conducted fighting retreats that preserved their forces but conceded territory. To the Loyalists pushing forward, it looked like the traitors were breaking, their resistance crumbling under the weight of the assault. Ferrus drove his forces forward aggressively, seeing the traitor withdrawal as confirmation that overwhelming force would end the rebellion quickly. The Iron Hands pushed deep into traitor-held territory, their armor columns rolling over abandoned fortifications and their infantry clearing positions the enemy had evacuated. The Salamanders and Raven Guard advanced as well, though both Vulcan and Corax maintained better tactical discipline than Ferrus, keeping their forces consolidated rather than allowing them to spread out in pursuit of retreating enemies. The 3 Loyalist legions were pushing the traitors back across a front that stretched for dozens of kilometers, and victory seemed within reach. The second wave of Loyalist forces began their descent as the first wave consolidated its gains. The Iron Warriors, Night Lords, Alpha Legion, and Word-Bearers deployed to landing zones behind the advancing first wave forces, positioning themselves to support the assault and complete the encirclement of the traitor positions. Their deployment proceeded smoothly, drop pods and landing craft delivering thousands of Space Marines to the surface without significant opposition. The traitor forces seemed too busy retreating from the first wave to contest the second wave's landing, and the operation appeared to be proceeding exactly as planned. The moment of betrayal came when the first wave legions were fully committed to their advance, spread across the operational area, and focused on maintaining pressure against the retreating traitors. The second wave legions opened fire on their supposed allies with coordinated precision that revealed months of planning. Iron Warriors' artillery batteries that had supposedly been positioning to support the Loyalist advance instead targeted Iron Hands' armor columns, their shells programmed with targeting data that had been gathered during joint training exercises. Night Lords' assault squads that were supposed to be moving forward to reinforce the Raven Guard instead attacked them from behind, hitting command elements and communication nodes with strikes designed to maximize confusion. Alpha Legion operatives who had infiltrated the Loyalist forces activated, sabotaging equipment and assassinating officers at critical moments. Word-bearers units that had landed among the salamanders revealed their true allegiance and opened fire at point-blank range. The killing field that Isstvan V became in those first minutes of betrayal defied comprehension, even for warriors who had spent their lives studying warfare. 3 entire Space Marine legions found themselves trapped between traitor forces on all sides, their formations disrupted, their command structures collapsing, their carefully planned assault transformed into a desperate struggle for survival. The Iron Hands suffered particularly catastrophic losses as Iron Warriors' artillery systematically destroyed their armor, leaving infantry formations exposed and vulnerable. The Salamanders found themselves fighting in all directions simultaneously as word-bearers attacked from behind while Death Guard and Emperor's Children pressed from the front. The Raven Guard's dispersed formations, which had been positioned to exploit enemy weaknesses, became isolated pockets that the Night Lords hunted through the ruins. The Sons of Horus had positioned themselves to serve as the hammer that would crush the Loyalists against the anvil of the second wave betrayal. When the trap sprung, Horus led his legion forward in a coordinated assault that demonstrated why they had been the Emperor's chosen instrument for the most critical operations. The Sons of Horus didn't simply attack, they identified the key points where the Loyalist formations were most vulnerable and struck with overwhelming force. Companies that had been held in reserve during the initial fighting now deployed with surgical precision, hitting Iron Hands positions that had been weakened by Iron Warriors' artillery, exploiting gaps in Salamander lines that Word-Bearers' attacks had created, cutting off Raven Guard units that were trying to withdraw to more defensible positions. The Juster and Terminators deployed directly into the heaviest fighting, teleporting into positions where their tactical dreadnought armor and close-quarters weapons could have maximum impact. Abaddon led the first company personally, his black Terminator plate instantly recognizable, even in the chaos of the massacre. The Justeran hit Iron Hands positions with the kind of brutal efficiency that had made them legendary throughout the legions. Their Storm Bolters cut down power-armored warriors at ranges where return fire couldn't penetrate Terminator plate, and when they closed to melee range, their power fists and lightning claws tore through anything that stood against them. Abaddon himself killed dozens of Iron Hands veterans, his skills honed through hundreds of campaigns, now turned against warriors who had once been brothers. The Justeran's tactical doctrine emphasized momentum and overwhelming violence at the point of contact. They didn't occupy positions or hold ground. They struck, killed everything in their immediate area, and then moved to the next target. This approach was devastatingly effective against Loyalists who were already reeling from the betrayal and trying to establish defensive perimeters. Every time Iron Hands units thought they had stabilized a position, the Justeran would appear and shatter their formations before teleporting away to hit another target. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical casualties. The Loyalists couldn't predict where the Terminators would strike next, couldn't prepare defenses when the enemy could appear directly in their midst. Ferrus Manus recognized what was happening faster than many of his officers, his tactical genius cutting through the confusion to understand the trap's full scope. The Iron Hands Primarch knew his legion was being destroyed, knew that without immediate action the entire first wave would be annihilated. He also knew that Horus would be commanding the traitor forces personally, coordinating the betrayal from a position where he could observe the entire battlefield. Ferrus made the decision that his nature demanded. He would kill the Warmaster, would cut the head off the rebellion, even if it cost him his life. The Iron Hands Primarch gathered his Morlocks, the Terminator armored veterans who served as his personal guard, and drove toward the center of the Sons of Horus positions, where his enhanced senses told him Horus would be. The fighting Ferrus and his Morlocks pushed through represented some of the most intense combat of the entire massacre. The Sons of Horus recognized what the Iron Hands Primarch was attempting, and threw everything they had at stopping him. Tactical squads established firing positions and poured bolter fire into the Morlocks, knowing their shots would be ineffective, but hoping to slow the advance. Devastator squads targeted Ferrus directly with las cannons and missile launchers, weapons that could threaten even a Primarch. Assault units tried to bog down the Morlocks in close combat, accepting catastrophic casualties to buy time for heavier forces to arrive. The Iron Hands veterans cut through everything in their path, their Terminator armor absorbing punishment that would have killed regular Astartes, their weapons reducing Sons of Horus warriors to shredded meat and shattered armor. Fulgrim intercepted Ferrus before the Iron Hands Primarch could reach Horus, and the confrontation between the two former friends became one of the defining moments of the massacre. Fulgrim had been corrupted by a demon weapon, his soul gradually consumed by the entity bound within the silver sword he carried. The Emperor's children Primarch had tried to convince Ferrus to join the rebellion, had offered his brother a place in the new order Horus was building, but Ferrus had rejected the offer with the absolute certainty that characterized everything he did. Now Fulgrim stood between Ferrus and his target, and both Primarchs knew only one of them would walk away from the confrontation. The duel was brief and brutal, two Primarchs fighting with the enhanced speed and strength that made them demigods among even space marines. Ferrus wielded Fireblade, a weapon he had forged himself that burned with barely contained energy. Fulgrim countered with the demon sword that had corrupted him, a blade that moved with unnatural speed and struck with force beyond what its appearance suggested. They had sparred together during the Great Crusade, knew each other's fighting styles intimately, and that knowledge made the combat even more vicious as each Primarch anticipated his opponent's moves and countered before attacks could land. Ferrus fought with the rage of betrayal driving every strike, his attacks powerful enough to shatter armor plate and crack the ground where they landed. Fulgrim moved with a grace that seemed wrong, his movements too fluid, too perfect, as if something other than a Primarch inhabited his body. The demon weapon whispered to Fulgrim, guided his strikes, and gave him advantages that pure skill couldn't provide. When Fulgrim's blade finally penetrated Ferrus's defenses and struck home, it wasn't through superior technique, but through the supernatural enhancement the demon provided. Ferrus Manus died on Isstvan V, the first Primarch to fall in the Heresy, and his death sent shockwaves through both loyalist and traitor forces. The Iron Hands warriors who witnessed their Primarch's fall responded with suicidal fury, charging the Emperor's children positions in berserker rages that threw away all tactical discipline. Some Iron Hands simply shut down, their purpose destroyed along with their gene sire, and stood motionless as traitor fire cut them down. The Legion that had prided itself on cold logic and mechanical precision shattered psychologically, the bonds that held them together severed by Ferrus's death. Fulgrim took his brother's head as a trophy, and the image of the Emperor's children Primarch holding Ferrus's severed head would become one of the most powerful propaganda tools the traitors possessed. Horus himself had been coordinating the massacre from a command position that gave him visibility across the entire battlefield, but when he learned that Ferrus was pushing toward his location, the Warmaster moved to intercept. Horus wanted to face his brother Primarchs personally, wanted them to understand that he wasn't hiding behind his forces, but was willing to fight them directly. When Fulgrim killed Ferrus before Horus could reach the Iron Hands Primarch, the Warmaster felt a mixture of disappointment and relief. Disappointment that he hadn't been the one to strike down a brother who had rejected his vision. Relief that Ferrus's death had been accomplished without requiring his direct involvement. The Warmaster's presence on the battlefield had effects beyond simple command and control. Horus radiated an aura of power that went beyond his natural charisma, a supernatural influence that the Chaos Gods had granted him. Sons of Horus warriors fought harder when their Primarch was nearby, their strikes landing with unnatural accuracy, their movements faster than should be possible. Loyalists who came close to Horus felt their resolve weakening, doubts creeping into their minds about whether they were fighting for the right side. The Warmaster had become something more than a Primarch, though exactly what he was becoming wouldn't be fully apparent until later in the Heresy. The Salamanders and Raven Guard recognized that the situation was unrecoverable and began fighting their way toward extraction points. Vulcan led his legion in a fighting withdrawal that prioritized preserving as many warriors as possible over maintaining territorial control. The Salamanders formed defensive perimeters and fell back in stages, each company covering the withdrawal of the others while inflicting maximum casualties on the traitors pressing them. Vulcan's presence held his legion together through the nightmare of the retreat, his voice on the Vox channels providing steady guidance even as the situation deteriorated around them. Corax and the Raven Guard used their mobility and stealth capabilities to break contact with the traitor forces and scatter across the operational area. The Raven Guard didn't try to maintain unit cohesion during the withdrawal. Instead, they broke into small groups that could move independently and evade pursuit. This approach saved more Raven Guard than would have survived a conventional retreat, though it meant the Legion would take months to reassemble after escaping Isstvan V. Corax himself led a fighting withdrawal that extracted thousands of his warriors, using his knowledge of the terrain and his legion's training to stay ahead of the Night Lords hunting them. The Iron Hands, leaderless and psychologically shattered, suffered the worst casualties of the three first-wave legions. Without Ferrus to coordinate their withdrawal, without the command structure that had held them together, the Iron Hands fragmented into isolated groups that the traitors hunted down systematically. Some Iron Hands units fought to the last warrior, selling their lives as expensively as possible, but achieving nothing except adding to the casualty count. Other groups tried to withdraw, but lacked the coordination to break contact successfully and were destroyed piecemeal. By the time the massacre concluded, the Iron Hands had been reduced to a fraction of their pre-battle strength, and the survivors were scattered across Isstvan V with no way to link up or organize effective resistance. The aftermath of Isstvan V left the traitors in complete control of the Isstvan system and gave Horus the time he needed to consolidate his forces for the march on Terra. 7 legions had deployed to crush his rebellion, and he had destroyed or crippled 4 of them, while revealing that 3 more served his cause. The strategic situation had shifted dramatically in the traitors' favor. The Imperium had committed a substantial portion of its Space Marine strength to Isstvan V, and the massacre had eliminated that strength without significantly weakening the traitor forces. The survivors who escaped would warn Terra about what had happened, but the warning would come too late to prevent Horus from seizing the initiative. The strategic situation after Isstvan V gave Horus breathing room he desperately needed, but it also revealed the fundamental challenge facing his rebellion. The Warmaster commanded 8 Space Marine legions and had demonstrated he could defeat loyalist forces in direct confrontation, yet the Imperium remained vastly larger than the forces he could bring to bear. Terra sat at the heart of an empire spanning 1,000,000 worlds, defended by the Custodian Guard, the Imperial Fists, and whatever other forces the Emperor could rally to the Throne World's defense. The traitors needed time to gather strength, to secure supply lines, and to prevent loyalist forces from concentrating against them before they were ready for the final assault on the solar system. The Word-Bearer's assault on Ultramar served this strategic purpose perfectly, though Lorgar's motivations went beyond simple military necessity. The Ultramarines represented everything the Word-Bearers despised, a legion that had embraced the imperial truth completely, that had built an empire within the Imperium based on reason and efficiency rather than faith and passion. Guilliman's 500 worlds of Ultramar were prosperous, well-governed, and completely committed to the secular vision the Emperor had proclaimed. The Word-Bearers had been humiliated decades earlier when the Emperor forced them to kneel at Monarchia and watch as the Imperium destroyed a city they had built as a monument to the Emperor's divinity. Lorgar had never forgiven that humiliation, and the attack on Calth represented both strategic calculation and personal vengeance. The Sons of Horus weren't directly involved in the Calth operation, but Horus had coordinated the timing carefully with Lorgar to ensure maximum strategic effect. The Word-Bearers struck just as news of Isstvan V was reaching Ultramar, catching Guilliman's forces off guard and unprepared for the scale of betrayal they faced. The Ultramarines had been preparing to march to Terra to reinforce the Emperor, gathering their strength for what they assumed would be a campaign to crush Horus's rebellion. Instead, they found themselves fighting for survival as the Word-Bearers, supported by substantial World Eater's forces, tore into Ultramar with a savagery that went beyond military necessity. The attack on Calth itself demonstrated how completely the Word-Bearers had embraced chaos worship. They didn't just attack military targets, they conducted rituals designed to tear holes in reality, summoning demons onto a world that had never seen such entities. The fighting in Calth's underground arcologies became a nightmare of Astartes, fighting not just their traitorous brothers, but creatures that shouldn't exist according to the imperial truth. The Ultramarines adapted with the flexibility that characterized Guilliman's teachings, but the sheer scale of the Word-Bearer's assault and the supernatural elements they introduced meant the 13th Legion would be tied up in Ultramar for years rather than marching to Terra's relief. The strategic effect was exactly what Horus needed. The Ultramarines were the largest legion, numbering well over 100,000 Astartes before the Word-Bearers struck. Guilliman's tactical genius and his legion's discipline made them perhaps the most dangerous single force the Loyalists could deploy against the traitors. By keeping the Ultramarines locked in a grinding war for Ultramar's survival, Horus ensured they couldn't interfere with his preparations for the Solar War. The Word-Bearers took horrific casualties in the process, but Lorgar's legion fought with the fervor of true believers who saw their suffering as holy martyrdom rather than simple military losses. The Sons of Horus spent the months after Isstvan V conducting a campaign across the Imperium that demonstrated Horus's strategic thinking and the Legion's evolution away from the warriors they had been during the Great Crusade. They struck at forge worlds that supplied the Loyalist war effort, at astropathic relay stations that allowed Terra to coordinate defensive operations, at naval facilities that serviced the fleets defending key systems. These weren't the decisive battles that the Great Crusade had emphasized. They were calculated strikes designed to weaken the Imperium's ability to resist the coming assault on Terra. The Sons of Horus had always excelled at identifying critical targets and applying overwhelming force to destroy them, but now that doctrine took on new dimensions as chaos corruption spread through the Legion's ranks. The possessed warriors who began appearing in the Legion's companies represented something that would have been unthinkable during the Great Crusade. These were Astartes who had allowed demons to inhabit their bodies, who had surrendered their humanity in exchange for power that went beyond what genetic engineering could provide. The possessed moved with unnatural speed, struck with strength that exceeded even Space Marine capabilities, and could survive wounds that should have killed them instantly. The integration of possessed warriors into the Legion's tactical structure happened gradually, with individual cases appearing first in companies that had been most heavily involved in the Warrior Lodge system. A sergeant would begin exhibiting strange behaviors, his eyes taking on an unnatural glow, his voice carrying harmonics that made his brothers uncomfortable. Officers who should have reported these changes to the apothecarium instead covered for their lodge brothers, rationalizing the changes as stress reactions or the effects of combat drugs. By the time the corruption became obvious enough that it couldn't be ignored, entire squads had been compromised, and the possessed had demonstrated combat effectiveness that made their commanders reluctant to eliminate them. Abaddon embraced the possessed warriors enthusiastically once their utility became apparent. The first captain had always prioritized effectiveness over ideological purity, and the possessed delivered results that justified their existence regardless of how disturbing their transformation appeared. When possessed warriors deployed alongside regular Astartes, they served as shock troops who could break enemy formations that conventional tactics couldn't crack. Their supernatural resilience meant they could absorb fire that would pin down regular squads, and their enhanced strength let them tear through fortifications that would require heavy weapons to breach. Abaddon integrated possessed squads into the first company's operations, using them as the tip of the spear in assaults where their advantages would have maximum impact. The Neverborn allies who began appearing alongside Sons of Horus forces represented an even more dramatic break with the Legion's past. These were demons summoned directly from the warp, entities of pure chaos given temporary physical form through rituals that Word-Bearers' advisors taught to Sons of Horus sorcerers. The concept of sorcery itself violated everything the imperial truth stood for. The Imperium had spent decades suppressing psychic practices that couldn't be controlled and regulated, and the use of warp-based powers to summon demons represented exactly the kind of superstitious barbarism the Great Crusade was supposed to eliminate. The Sons of Horus, who witnessed these summonings for the first time, struggled to reconcile what they saw with the worldview they had been taught. The imperial truth claimed there were no gods, no supernatural forces, that everything could be explained through material science. Yet here were creatures that clearly existed, that demonstrated powers that science couldn't explain, that served the Sons of Horus in battle against the Imperium that denied their existence. The cognitive dissonance this created was profound, and different warriors resolved it in different ways. Some embraced the new reality enthusiastically, seeing the Chaos Gods as sources of power that the Emperor had deliberately hidden from his sons. Others maintained their loyalty to Horus, while refusing to participate directly in rituals or work alongside demonic entities. A few tried to resist the corruption entirely and were quietly eliminated by Lodge brothers who recognized them as potential threats. The physical mutations spreading through the Legion's ranks became impossible to hide as the campaign progressed. Warriors developed growths that pushed through their armor, extra limbs that sprouted from their torsos, sensory organs that appeared in places where human anatomy didn't support them. Some mutations provided tactical advantages, enhanced vision that could see in spectrums regular Astartes couldn't perceive, additional arms that could wield more weapons simultaneously, altered metabolisms that required less rest, and could process a wider range of substances for nutrition. Other mutations were purely detrimental, causing pain and disability that reduced combat effectiveness. The apothecaries who should have been treating these conditions as diseases instead began studying them as phenomena to be understood and potentially controlled. The corruption affected different warriors in different ways based on their personalities and the specific chaos powers influencing them. Warriors who had always been aggressive and glory-seeking found themselves drawn toward Khorne, developing mutations that enhanced their combat capabilities while stripping away anything that might interfere with pure violence. Those who had taken pride in their martial skills and the perfection of their techniques gravitated toward Slaanesh, pursuing ever greater heights of sensation and experience. The intellectually curious found Tzeentch's influence, developing psychic abilities and mutations that reflected the Changer of Ways' interest in knowledge and transformation. Even Nurgle's touch appeared among some Sons of Horus, though his influence remained relatively minor compared to the other chaos powers. The Siege of Malech represented a critical turning point both strategically and in terms of Horus's personal transformation. The night world of Malech held secrets dating back to the Emperor's own past. It was here that the Emperor had entered a warp gate and bargained with the Chaos Gods for the power to create the Primarchs. Horus knew this because the visions he had experienced on Davin had shown him truths about his creation that the Emperor had never revealed. The Warmaster understood that if he could reach the same warp gate and make his own bargain with the ruinous powers, he could gain strength sufficient to challenge the Emperor directly. Malech's defenses were substantial, anchored by knight households that had served the Imperium since before the Great Crusade, and supported by significant Imperial army forces. The planet's strategic importance meant it had been heavily fortified, with orbital defense platforms and ground-based weapons emplacements that could threaten even a space marine assault. Horus committed substantial forces to the siege, including significant elements of the Sons of Horus, alongside contingents from other traitor legions. The fighting was brutal and prolonged, grinding through Malech's defenses layer by layer as the traitors pushed toward the locations where ancient records suggested the warp gate might be found. The Sons of Horus fought through Malech's cities and fortifications with the efficiency that had always characterized their operations, but now that efficiency was enhanced by the chaos powers they had embraced. Possessed warriors led assaults on key strongpoints, their supernatural resilience allowing them to survive defensive fire that would have stopped conventional troops. Sorcerers used warp-based powers to disrupt enemy communications and sow confusion among the defenders. Demon engines, war machines inhabited by never-born entities, provided heavy support that conventional armor couldn't match. The combination of space marine tactical excellence and chaos enhanced capabilities proved overwhelming, and Malech's defenses crumbled despite fierce resistance from the knight households. Horus's entry into the warp gate and his subsequent apotheosis remained shrouded in mystery, even to his closest followers. The Warmaster took only a small honor guard with him when he descended into the ancient facility housing the gate, and most of those warriors didn't survive the experience. What happened in the warp, what bargains Horus made with the Chaos gods, what price he paid for the power he gained, these details were known only to Horus himself. When he emerged, he had been transformed in ways that went beyond physical appearance. The Warmaster radiated power that made even other Primarchs uncomfortable, and his presence in the warp had grown so strong that Psykers could sense him across star systems. The strategic effect of Malech's fall rippled across the Imperium. The world had been a key node in the defensive network protecting the approaches to the solar system, and its loss opened routes that traitor forces could exploit. More importantly, Horus's transformation gave the traitor cause a figurehead who could genuinely challenge the Emperor. The other traitor Primarchs recognized that Horus had become something more than their equal, that he now possessed power that placed him in a category approaching the Emperor's own capabilities. This recognition solidified the command structure of the traitor forces. Whatever doubts individual Primarchs might have about specific tactical decisions, they accepted that Horus was the only one among them who could lead the assault on Terra with any hope of victory. The Battle of Beta Garman represented the largest fleet engagement of the entire heresy, a grinding void war that lasted months and consumed resources on a scale that dwarfed most planetary campaigns. Beta Garman sat astride the most direct route from Isstvan to Terra, a cluster of forge worlds and naval facilities that the Imperium had fortified heavily after the massacre at Isstvan V. The Loyalists understood that if they could hold Beta Garman, they could delay the traitor advance long enough for reinforcements to reach Terra from distant sectors. The traitors recognized that Beta Garman had to fall before they could approach the solar system with their full strength. The Sons of Horus participated in the Beta Garman campaign primarily through boarding actions and ship-to-ship combat rather than large-scale ground operations. The Void War required different tactics than the planetary assaults that had characterized most of the heresy's major battles, and Horus deployed his legion to exploit their strengths in close-quarters combat and rapid assault operations. Sons of Horus boarding parties teleported onto Loyalist capital ships, fought through their corridors to reach critical systems, and sabotaged or captured vessels that might otherwise have continued threatening the traitor fleet. The mutation and corruption spreading through the Legion became advantages in the confined spaces of ship-to-ship combat. Warriors with enhanced sensory organs could detect enemies hiding in damaged sections where regular Astartes would be effectively blind. Those with additional limbs could fight more effectively in zero-gravity environments where conventional combat techniques were less useful. The possessed warriors excelled in boarding actions, their supernatural resilience letting them absorb fire in narrow corridors where there was no room to maneuver, their enhanced strength allowing them to tear through bulkheads and sealed hatches that would require specialized equipment to breach. The grinding nature of the Beta Garman campaign wore down both sides, but the traitors had advantages in sustainability that the Loyalists couldn't match. Forge worlds that had sided with Horus could replace losses and repair damaged ships faster than Loyalist facilities operating under constant threat of traitor raids. The Mechanicum forces serving the Warmaster had embraced the Dark Mechanicum's innovations, incorporating demonic elements into their war machines and accepting corrupted technology that the Orthodox Mechanicum would reject. These advantages accumulated over months of fighting, gradually shifting the balance in the traitors' favor despite fierce Loyalist resistance. The fall of Beta Garman opened the approach to the solar system and forced the Imperium to accept that the final confrontation would happen at Terra itself. The Loyalist forces that survived the campaign withdrew toward the throne world, abandoning outer defensive lines to concentrate their remaining strength at humanity's birthplace. Horus had achieved his strategic objective, but the cost had been substantial. The traitor forces approaching Terra were weaker than they had been at Isstvan V, worn down by years of campaigning and the losses taken at Beta Garman. The Warmaster would reach Terra, but whether he had sufficient strength remaining to break through its defenses remained uncertain. The Sons of Horus approaching the solar system were barely recognizable as the Legion that had begun the Great Crusade decades earlier. Their armor, once white and green, now displayed the sea green and black that reflected their corruption. The Eye of Horus that marked their shoulder plates had taken on sinister connotations, representing not just their Primarch's watchfulness, but his pact with powers that the Imperium had spent centuries denying existed. The warriors themselves had changed even more dramatically than their equipment. Mutations were common enough that unmarked Astartes were becoming the exception rather than the rule, and the integration of possessed warriors and demonic allies into tactical operations had become standard practice. The solar system's outer defenses had been fortified over decades, transformed from the modest patrol stations that had protected humanity's birthplace during the Great Crusade into a network of weapon platforms, minefields, and fleet anchorages that should have made any assault prohibitively costly. Pluto's moon Hydra hosted gun batteries capable of crippling capital ships at extreme range. Neptune's orbital stations monitored approach vectors and coordinated defensive deployments. Uranus served as a mustering point for loyalist fleet elements withdrawing from Beta Garmin and other failed defensive lines. The Imperium had committed everything it could spare to making the solar system an impregnable fortress, and the defenses reflected both the desperation of Terra's defenders and the industrial capacity of an empire that still controlled most of the galaxy despite the heresy's devastations. Horus approached these defenses with the same tactical acumen that had made him Warmaster, but now enhanced by powers that went beyond conventional military genius. The trader fleet that entered the solar system was the largest armada humanity had assembled since the Dark Age of technology, hundreds of capital ships supported by thousands of escorts and transports. The Sons of Horus fleet elements formed the spearhead, their ships marked with the Eye of Horus and painted in colors that seemed to shift and writhe when observed directly. The vengeful spirit led the advance, the massive battleship's hull covered in mutations that blurred the line between vessel and living organism, its weapon batteries enhanced by mechanisms that drew power directly from the warp. The solar war that followed the trader fleet's arrival consumed weeks and cost both sides losses that would have been unthinkable during the Great Crusade. The outer system defenses fell in sequence as the traders ground through them, accepting casualties that a conventional commander would have considered catastrophic, but that Horus deemed acceptable given the strategic objective. Pluto's gun platforms destroyed dozens of trader ships before being overwhelmed by concentrated fire from vessels that had been positioned specifically to neutralize them. Neptune's stations held longer, their defenders fighting with the desperation of warriors who knew they were buying time for Terra's final preparations. But eventually they too fell silent as trader boarding parties secured them or orbital bombardment reduced them to debris. The Sons of Horus participated in the Void War through the boarding actions and ship-to-ship combat that had become their specialty during the Beta Garmin campaign. Their expertise in close-quarters fighting translated perfectly to the confined spaces of orbital platforms and enemy vessels, and their corruption provided advantages that conventional space marines couldn't match. Possessed warriors led boarding parties through sections of enemy ships where hull breaches and radiation should have been instantly lethal, their demonically enhanced bodies surviving conditions that would kill regular Astartes within seconds. Sorcerers used warp-based powers to teleport strike teams directly onto enemy bridges, bypassing defensive choke points, and allowing the Sons of Horus to capture or destroy vessels before their crews could mount effective resistance. The breakthrough into the inner system came when trader forces secured Luna, the moon that orbited Terra itself and hosted shipyards, training facilities, and defensive installations that were critical to the throne world's protection. The battle for Luna demonstrated the trader forces' willingness to accept any cost to achieve their objectives. The Sons of Horus deployed in strength alongside World Eaters and Emperor's Children, the three legions hitting Luna's defenses simultaneously across multiple landing zones. The fighting was apocalyptic, space marines battling through industrial complexes and void dock facilities in combat that left entire sections of Luna's surface cratered and burning. The Sons of Horus' assault on Luna's primary spaceport showed how completely they had integrated chaos-enhanced capabilities into their tactical doctrine. The spaceport was defended by Imperial Fist's elements, who had fortified it according to Rogel Dorn's exacting standards, creating overlapping fields of fire and defensive positions that should have been able to hold against forces many times their size. The Sons of Horus approached the problem by summoning demons directly into the spaceport's interior spaces, bypassing the external defenses entirely. The Neverborn entities materialized inside bunkers and command centers, killing defenders and opening access points that allowed physical assault forces to penetrate the facility. By the time the Imperial Fists realized what was happening, Sons of Horus warriors were fighting through the spaceport's corridors, while demons held key choke points and prevented reinforcements from reaching threatened sectors. The fall of Luna gave the traitors control of the orbital space around Terra and allowed them to begin deploying ground forces to the throne world itself. The initial landings focused on securing spaceports and landing zones that could accommodate the massive influx of troops and equipment required for a siege of Terra's scale. The Sons of Horus were assigned to the Lion's Gate spaceport, one of the largest and most strategically important facilities on Terra's surface. The spaceport sat at a nexus of transit routes that connected to the Imperial Palace, and its capture would give the traitors a staging area from which they could launch assaults directly into the heart of the Imperium's power. The deployment to Lion's Gate demonstrated the Sons of Horus's evolution into a force that bore little resemblance to the Luna Wolves who had fought during the Great Crusade's early years. The warriors who descended from orbit in drop pods and assault craft were marked by mutations that ranged from subtle to grotesque. Some had developed additional sensory organs that gave them advantages in targeting and threat detection. Others showed physical alterations that enhanced their combat capabilities, reinforced bone structures that made them more resistant to injury, altered muscle configurations that provided greater strength, modified metabolisms that allowed them to fight longer without rest. The most heavily corrupted displayed changes that went beyond simple enhancement into territory that was clearly demonic, warriors whose armor had fused with their flesh, whose weapons had become extensions of their bodies, whose very presence radiated an aura of wrongness that affected even other traitors. The fighting for Lion's Gate spaceport lasted days, a grinding battle through the facility's massive structures and surrounding defensive works. The Imperial Fists defending the spaceport had prepared for exactly this kind of assault, establishing kill zones and fortified positions that forced attackers to advance through concentrated fire. The Sons of Horus adapted their tactics to the defensive layout, using possessed warriors as shock troops who could absorb fire, while regular Astartes maneuvered into flanking positions. Sorcerers disrupted Imperial Fists' communications and command structures, creating confusion that prevented coordinated responses to Sons of Horus advances. Demon engines provided heavy fire support, their weapons powered by warp energies that could penetrate fortifications conventional artillery couldn't breach. Abaddon led the first company in the assault on Lion's Gate's central control complex, the facility that coordinated spaceport operations and controlled its defensive systems. The Juster and Terminators teleported directly into the complex's lower levels, bypassing the external defenses that had held up other assault forces. The Imperial Fists garrison recognized the threat immediately and committed their own Terminator armored veterans to contain the breach, leading to close-quarters combat in corridors and chambers that echoed with the thunder of storm bolters and the screech of power weapons cutting through ceramite. Abaddon fought with a fury that seemed to draw strength from the violence itself, his black Terminator plate covered in the blood of Imperial Fists he had killed, his weapons crackling with energies that went beyond their original specifications. The capture of Lion's Gate gave the Sons of Horus their primary staging area for operations against the Imperial Palace itself, but the spaceport was just the beginning of a siege that would consume months and cost millions of lives. The palace's defenses had been designed by Rogel Dorn personally, the Imperial Fists Primarch applying everything he had learned during the Great Crusade to creating fortifications that could withstand any conceivable assault. The outer defensive works extended for hundreds of kilometers around the palace proper, layers of walls, trenches, bunkers, and weapon emplacements that had been built up over years of preparation. Behind these outer works stood the palace walls themselves, structures so massive that starships could have landed on their ramparts, their foundations driven deep into Terra's bedrock and reinforced with materials that could resist orbital bombardment. The Sons of Horus approach to breaching these defenses emphasized coordinated operations with the other traitor legions rather than attempting to carry the siege through their own efforts alone. Horus positioned his legion as the central element of the assault, coordinating attacks across multiple fronts while maintaining pressure on the key approaches to the palace. The Sons of Horus struck at the Mercury Exultant Wall, one of the outer defensive lines that protected the palace's southern approaches. The wall was defended by a mixture of Imperial fists, Blood Angels, and White Scars elements, space marines from legions whose combat doctrines complemented each other and created defensive synergies that made the position exceptionally difficult to assault. The assault on the Mercury Exultant Wall showed how the Sons of Horus had learned to exploit the weaknesses created by the Imperium's reliance on the Imperial Truth's denials of warp-based threats. The defenders had prepared for conventional assault tactics, armored advances, aerial insertions, siege artillery bombardments. They had not prepared adequately for the demonic incursions that the Sons of Horus could now facilitate through their sorcerers and the rituals they had learned from Word-Bearer's advisors. Demons materialized behind the wall's defenses, attacking command posts and supply depots that should have been secure. The defenders found themselves fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously, their attention divided between the conventional assault forces advancing on the wall's exterior and the supernatural threats appearing in their rear areas. The grinding nature of the siege wore down both attackers and defenders, but the traitors had advantages that accumulated over time. The Chaos Gods provided their servants with reinforcements that didn't depend on conventional logistics. Demons could be summoned repeatedly, and while banishing them required effort and casualties, they could return as long as sorcerers maintained the rituals that gave them physical form. The traitor legions could draw on forge worlds throughout the territories they controlled, replacing losses and resupplying their forces, while the defenders were limited to what Terra itself could produce, and what supplies had been stockpiled before the siege began. The Sons of Horus coordination with other traitor forces demonstrated Horus's continued ability to manage the competing agendas and tactical preferences of Primarchs whose approaches to warfare often conflicted. The World Eaters wanted to charge directly at the palace walls, accepting any casualties to close with their enemies and engage in the close combat their nature demanded. The Emperor's children pursued perfection in their assaults, sometimes spending days preparing for attacks that other legions would have launched immediately. The Death Guard ground forward with methodical patience, accepting horrific losses to advance meter by meter through defensive positions. Horus balanced these different approaches, assigning each legion to sectors where their strengths would be most effective, while preventing their weaknesses from undermining the broader siege effort. The breakthrough to the palace outworks came after weeks of grinding combat that had consumed entire companies of space marines on both sides. The Sons of Horus penetrated the outer defensive lines in the southern sectors, pushing through gaps created by coordinated assaults that had stretched the defenders beyond their ability to maintain continuous lines. The fighting in the outworks was different from the siege warfare that had characterized the assault on the outer walls. Here the combat was closer, more personal, space marines fighting through trenches and bunker complexes at ranges where they could see their enemies' faces through their helmet lenses. The Sons of Horus excelled in this environment, their experience with close-quarters combat and their chaos-enhanced capabilities giving them advantages that conventional tactics couldn't match. Possessed warriors led assaults on bunker complexes, their supernatural resilience allowing them to survive defensive fire long enough to close with the defenders and tear through them in melee combat. Regular Astartes followed behind the possessed, exploiting the breaches they created and consolidating positions before defenders could counterattack. The combination of shock assault and tactical consolidation pushed the Sons of Horus deeper into the outworks, forcing the defenders to commit reserves to contain breaches that threatened to collapse entire defensive sectors. The psychological warfare that accompanied the physical assault represented another dimension of the Sons of Horus's evolved capabilities. The corruption spreading through the Legion-created warriors, whose very appearance could shake enemy morale, defenders who saw Sons of Horus advancing with mutations that defied natural law, accompanied by demons that shouldn't exist according to everything the Imperial truth had taught them, sometimes broke and fled rather than standing to fight. The Sons of Horus exploited this psychological impact deliberately, using possessed warriors and demon allies as the visible face of their assaults, while less corrupted elements maneuvered to exploit the confusion and fear their presence created. The Emperor's decision to teleport to the Vengeful Spirit came after months of siege warfare had ground down both sides without producing a decisive result. The palace's defenses remained intact despite the traitors' advances, but the defenders were being worn down through attrition they couldn't sustain indefinitely. Horus had established himself in a command position aboard his flagship, coordinating the siege from orbit rather than leading assaults personally. The Warmaster's presence on the Vengeful Spirit was both strategic necessity. He needed the command and control capabilities the flagship provided to manage operations across Terra's surface, and psychological warfare, forcing the defenders to recognize that their enemy commanded from safety while they died in the palace's trenches. The teleportation assault that brought the Emperor, Sanguinius, and Rogaldorn directly to the Vengeful Spirit represented a calculated risk that reflected the Emperor's assessment of the strategic situation. The siege could continue for months or years, grinding down the defenders until the palace fell through simple exhaustion, or it could be ended immediately by killing Horus and decapitating the traitor command structure. The Emperor chose to strike directly at the source of the rebellion, teleporting to the Vengeful Spirit with his two most trusted sons to confront the Warmaster in personal combat. The Vengeful Spirit had been transformed during the years since Davin into something that barely resembled the warship it had been during the Great Crusade. The vessel's interior spaces had been corrupted by warp energies, corridors twisted into geometries that violated natural law, chambers that existed in dimensions that shouldn't be accessible from real space. The Sons of Horus, who crewed the flagship, had adapted to this environment, their mutations and corruption allowing them to navigate spaces that would drive unprotected humans insane. When the Emperor and his companions materialized aboard the ship, they found themselves in a nightmare landscape where the normal rules of physics and causality no longer fully applied. The fighting through the Vengeful Spirit's corridors toward Horus's location demonstrated the Emperor's raw power and the capabilities of the two Primarchs accompanying him. Sanguinius fought with a grace that made combat appear effortless, his blade striking with precision that left Sons of Horus warriors dead before they could react to his presence. Rogaldorn advanced with methodical efficiency, his storm bolter cutting down enemies while his power fist crushed any who closed to melee range. The Emperor moved through the ship's defenders like a force of nature, his presence alone enough to make lesser warriors flee, and his psychic powers incinerating those who stood against him. The Sons of Horus defending their flagship fought with desperate intensity, knowing that their Primarch's life depended on delaying the Emperor's advance long enough for Horus to prepare for the confrontation. Terminator armored veterans established defensive positions in key corridors, accepting certain death to buy minutes for their Warmaster. Possessed warriors threw themselves at the Emperor and his companions in suicidal assaults that achieved nothing except adding seconds to the delay. Sorcerers attempted to use warp-based powers to slow the advance, summoning demons and creating reality distortions that the Emperor dispersed with contemptuous ease. The throne room where Horus awaited his father had been transformed into a temple dedicated to chaos undivided, a space where the influence of all four ruinous powers manifested simultaneously. The Warmaster stood at the chamber's center, his form radiating power that went far beyond what any Primarch should possess. The bargain he had made in the warp gate on Malech had transformed him into something approaching a god, empowered by all four chaos gods working in concert toward the singular goal of killing the Emperor. Horus's appearance retained enough of his original form to be recognizable, but the corruption was obvious in the way reality seemed to bend around him, in the energies that crackled across his armor, in the aura of wrongness that filled the chamber. Sanguinius reached the throne room first, his speed allowing him to outdistance even the Emperor's advance. The Blood Angel's Primarch confronted Horus alone, trying one final time to reach the brother he had loved, to find some remnant of the Warmaster who had been the Emperor's chosen son. The conversation between them was brief, Sanguinius pleading with Horus to recognize what he had become and to turn back from the path that could only end in his destruction. Horus's response made clear that nothing remained of the Primarch who had led the Great Crusade. The being standing before Sanguinius was a puppet of the Chaos Gods, empowered by their gifts, but ultimately serving their purposes rather than his own. The duel between Sanguinius and Horus was brief and brutal, the Blood Angel's Primarch fighting with everything he possessed against an opponent whose power had been magnified beyond natural limits. Sanguinius had foreseen his death in this moment, had known since before the siege began that he would die at Horus's hands, but he fought anyway because his sacrifice would weaken the Warmaster enough that the Emperor might prevail. The prescient visions that had plagued Sanguinius throughout his life showed him the exact sequence of the combat, showed him where Horus's guard would drop, showed him the opening that would allow a mortal strike. Sanguinius took that opening, driving his blade deep into Horus's chest, inflicting a wound that would have killed any normal Primarch. Horus killed Sanguinius in return, his power claw tearing through the Blood Angel's Primarch's armor and crushing the life from his body. The Warmaster's empowerment by the Chaos Gods allowed him to survive the wound Sanguinius had inflicted, though it weakened him significantly. When the Emperor entered the throne room moments later, he found his most beloved son dead at the Warmaster's feet, and the sight of Sanguinius's broken body triggered a rage in the Emperor that went beyond anything his enemies had anticipated. The final confrontation between the Emperor and Horus represented the culmination of everything the heresy had built toward, a duel between the master of mankind and the son who had betrayed him. Horus fought with power drawn from all four Chaos Gods, his strikes backed by energies that could crack planets, his defenses reinforced by blessings that made him nearly invulnerable. The Emperor held back initially, still hoping to save his son, to burn away the chaos corruption and reclaim the Primarch he had created. This restraint nearly cost the Emperor everything. Horus exploited the hesitation, landing blows that wounded even the Emperor's enhanced form, demonstrating that the Chaos God's empowerment had made him genuinely dangerous even to the most powerful psyker humanity had ever produced. The turning point came when the Emperor recognized that nothing of Horus remained to be saved, that the Warmaster's soul had been consumed completely by the powers he had embraced. The Emperor stopped holding back and unleashed the full extent of his psychic might. Power that could reshape reality itself turned against the son who had doomed the Imperium to civil war. The psychic assault burned through Horus's chaos-granted defenses, stripped away the empowerment the ruinous powers had provided, and left the Warmaster's soul exposed and vulnerable. The Emperor struck with finality, not just killing Horus's body, but annihilating his soul completely, ensuring that nothing of the Warmaster could survive to be resurrected or reborn. The psychic shockwave that accompanied Horus's final death aboard the vengeful spirit hit the Sons of Horus like a physical blow. Warriors fighting in the palace trenches felt their Primarch's soul being annihilated, the bond that connected them to their gene sire severed so completely that some believed they were dying alongside him. The immediate effect was catastrophic disorganization. Companies that had been executing coordinated assaults dissolved into individual squads, or even lone warriors acting without direction. Officers who tried to maintain command found their orders ignored by warriors who had lost the fundamental anchor of their identity. The Legion that had prided itself on decisive action and overwhelming force became a mob of confused, angry space marines who understood that everything they had fought for had just died with their Primarch. The other traitor legions responded to Horus's death with varying degrees of coherence, but none maintained the offensive operations that had been grinding toward victory just hours earlier. The World Eaters descended into mindless slaughter, the butcher's nails driving them to kill anything within reach regardless of tactical objectives. The Emperor's children withdrew to their positions and began conducting rituals that served no military purpose, their pursuit of sensation and experience taking precedence over the siege they had been prosecuting. The Death Guard pulled back in relatively good order, Mortarion recognizing that without Horus to coordinate the assault, the siege had become unwinnable. The Night Lords simply disappeared, their preference for terror tactics meaningless in a situation where the defenders had already endured months of the worst warfare imaginable. The Sons of Horus' retreat from Terra was a chaotic affair that bore no resemblance to the disciplined withdrawals they had executed during the Great Crusade. Companies abandoned their positions without coordinating with adjacent units, leaving gaps that Loyalist forces exploited to attack withdrawing formations. Equipment was left behind as warriors prioritized escape over salvaging valuable war materiel. The carefully constructed supply lines that had sustained the siege collapsed as logistical personnel fled alongside combat troops, leaving thousands of tons of ammunition and supplies to be captured by advancing Loyalists. The retreat became a rout, and the rout became a massacre as Blood Angels and White Scar's elements pursued the fleeing traitors with a fury born from months of desperate defense. Abaddon managed to extract significant elements of the First Company through a combination of ruthless discipline and tactical acumen that hadn't abandoned him despite the psychic trauma of losing Horus. The first captain recognized that the Sons of Horus needed to reach their ships and escape the solar system before the Loyalist fleet could reorganize and trap them in orbit around Terra. He gathered what forces he could control, established a perimeter around one of the remaining functional spaceports, and coordinated an evacuation that prioritized getting warriors off the surface over maintaining unit cohesion or recovering equipment. The Juster and Terminators served as a rearguard, their tactical dreadnought armor allowing them to hold defensive positions long enough for less well-protected warriors to board transports and escape. The evacuation was brutal and costly, with thousands of Sons of Horus dying in the fighting around the spaceport or being left behind when transport capacity ran out. Abaddon made decisions that would haunt him for the rest of his existence, choosing which companies would be evacuated and which would be abandoned to buy time with their lives. Warriors who had fought beside him for decades were left to die because their positions were too exposed or because the transports were already overloaded. The first captain's face remained expressionless as he made these choices, his voice steady as he gave orders that condemned his brothers to death, but the weight of those decisions added to the rage and bitterness that was already consuming him. The flight from the solar system saw the Sons of Horus fleet scattered and pursued by Loyalist forces that wanted vengeance for the heresy's devastations. The vengeful spirit, corrupted and damaged from the Emperor's assault, led a ragged formation of capital ships and escorts that had managed to extract from Terra's orbit before the Loyalist blockade could reform. Other Sons of Horus vessels fled independently, their captains making individual decisions about routes and destinations without coordinating with the broader fleet. The unity that had characterized the Legion's operations during the Great Crusade and the early heresy had shattered along with Horus's death, leaving only fragments that pursued their own survival without regard for their brothers' fates. The great scouring that followed the siege of Terra saw the Imperium's Loyalist forces hunting the traitor legions across the galaxy with systematic brutality. The Sons of Horus, as the Warmaster's own legion and the most visible symbol of the rebellion, became priority targets for Loyalist pursuit forces. Blood Angel's successors hunted them with particular intensity, seeking vengeance for Sanguinius's death at Horus's hands. White Scar's forces pursued them through the void, their speed and mobility allowing them to intercept fleeing Sons of Horus ships before they could reach safe harbor. Even the Ultramarines, still recovering from the Word-Bearer's assault on Ultramar, dispatched elements to participate in the pursuit of the Legion that had led the rebellion. The Sons of Horus found temporary refuge in systems that had sided with Horus during the heresy, worlds where local populations still supported the rebellion despite its failure at Terra. These refuges proved temporary as loyalist forces systematically reduced each stronghold, conducting compliance actions that made the original Great Crusade look gentle by comparison. Populations that had welcomed the Sons of Horus were exterminated or enslaved, their worlds subjected to orbital bombardment that left them barely habitable. The Sons of Horus defending these positions fought with the desperation of warriors who understood they had nowhere left to retreat, but desperation couldn't overcome the numerical and material superiority the Loyalists brought to each engagement. The internal conflicts that tore through the Sons of Horus during their flight and the early scouring reflected the collapse of the command structure that had held the Legion together. Without Horus to serve as the ultimate authority, rival officers competed for leadership based on their rank, their combat records, or simply their ability to gather followers through force of personality. Abaddon commanded the largest single faction, his control of the First Company and his reputation as the Warmaster's chosen champion giving him legitimacy that other claimants lacked. But other officers disputed his authority, arguing that the first captain's decisions during the retreat from Terra had been cowardly, or that his willingness to abandon brothers to save the Legion's core had disqualified him from leadership. The fate of Horus's body became a focal point for these internal conflicts in ways that revealed how completely the Legion had been corrupted by chaos. The Emperor had annihilated Horus's soul, but his physical remains still existed, and various factions within the Sons of Horus believed they could use those remains for purposes ranging from creating a shrine that would serve as a rallying point to attempting to resurrect their Primarch through demonic rituals. Fabius Bile, the chief apothecary who had been conducting increasingly disturbing experiments throughout the heresy, proposed a solution that he claimed would restore Horus without requiring deals with the ruinous powers, cloning the Warmaster using genetic material harvested from his corpse. Bile's cloning attempts began in hidden facilities the Sons of Horus had established in systems far from the Imperium's reach. The chief apothecary had been experimenting with advanced genetic manipulation for years, his work pushing far beyond what the Emperor's original Astartes project had attempted. Bile believed he could recreate Horus by combining genetic material from the Warmaster's body with samples taken from living Sons of Horus who carried their Primarch's gene seed. The process required resources and time that the fleeing Legion could barely spare, but enough officers supported the project that Bile received what he needed to begin his work. The results were abominations that bore only superficial resemblance to Horus. The clones grew rapidly in their vats, their bodies developing at rates that natural gestation couldn't match, but the accelerated process created instabilities that became apparent as soon as the subjects achieved consciousness. Some clones emerged physically malformed, their enhanced bodies twisted by genetic errors that Bile's techniques couldn't prevent. Others appeared physically perfect, but lacked the intelligence and personality that had made Horus the Warmaster. They possessed a Primarch strength and resilience, but the mental capacity of servitors, responding to simple commands but incapable of independent thought or tactical reasoning. The most disturbing clones were those that developed personalities, but personalities that reflected only fragments of what Horus had been. One clone displayed the Warmaster's charisma and tactical genius, but lacked any capacity for loyalty or brotherhood, viewing other beings purely as tools to be used and discarded. Another showed Horus's ambition and drive, but none of his restraint, demanding worship from the Sons of Horus and flying into murderous rages when his commands weren't obeyed instantly. A third seemed to channel the chaos corruption that had consumed Horus during the heresy, its body mutating rapidly, and its presence causing reality distortions that made it dangerous to approach even for heavily corrupted Sons of Horus warriors. Abaddon watched these abominations emerge from Bile's laboratories with growing horror and rage. The first captain had followed Horus with absolute devotion, had believed in the Warmaster's vision for the Imperium, and had committed himself completely to the rebellion Horus led. Seeing his gene sire reduced to these twisted mockeries felt like a desecration, worse than anything the Imperium could have inflicted. The clones weren't Horus, they were insults to his memory, proof that whatever had made the Warmaster great couldn't be recreated through genetic manipulation or any other technique Bile possessed. The confrontation between Abaddon and Bile over the cloning program escalated as more failures emerged from the laboratories. The chief apothecary insisted that each failure brought him closer to success, that given enough time and resources, he could perfect the process and restore Horus to the Legion. Abaddon recognized that Bile was deluding himself, that the Warmaster's greatness had come from more than just his genetic structure, and that attempting to recreate him was both futile and disrespectful. The argument reflected deeper divisions within the Sons of Horus about their purpose and identity. Were they Horus's sons who should dedicate themselves to preserving his legacy, or were they warriors who needed to forge their own path now that their Primarch was gone? The slave wars that consumed the Sons of Horus during the middle period of the Scouring reflected the Legion's descent into barbarism, as their resources and cohesion continued to deteriorate. Cut off from the Forge worlds that had supplied them during the Heresy, unable to recruit new warriors to replace their losses, the Sons of Horus turned to raiding Imperial and non-Imperial worlds alike for the materials and personnel they needed to sustain themselves. These raids had none of the strategic purpose that had characterized their operations during the Great Crusade or even the early Heresy. They were simple piracy, taking what they needed and destroying what they couldn't carry away. The raids brought the Sons of Horus into conflict with other traitor forces who were conducting their own operations in the same regions of space. The Legion wars that erupted in the Eye of Terror and surrounding areas saw former allies fighting each other over resources, territory, and simple survival. The Sons of Horus clashed with World Eaters' warbands over contested raiding targets, fought Emperor's Children forces who tried to claim ships and equipment the Sons of Horus had captured, and skirmished with Night Lord's elements who used the chaos of the Scouring to pursue their own agendas. These conflicts consumed warriors and materiel that the Sons of Horus could barely afford to lose, but the alternative was accepting subordination to other traitor forces or slowly withering away as attrition ground them down. The internal conflicts within the Sons of Horus reached their peak when Abaddon decided that the Legion's continued existence in its current form was impossible and undesirable. The first captain had spent years watching his brothers tear themselves apart over leadership disputes, resource allocation, and the question of Horus's legacy. He had seen the cloning abominations that Bile produced, had fought in the pointless slave wars that accomplished nothing except adding to the Legion's casualty lists, and had recognized that the Sons of Horus were dying not from external pressure, but from their inability to move beyond their Primarch's death. The Legion's name itself had become a chain holding them to a past that no longer existed, preventing them from adapting to the reality of their situation. Abaddon's destruction of Horus's genetic legacy was methodical and absolute. He led the first company in an assault on the facility where Bile had been conducting his cloning experiments, killing the abominations that had been created and destroying the genetic samples that might have allowed future attempts. Bile himself escaped, his skills as an apothecary and his value to various traitor forces ensuring he had allies who would shelter him, but his cloning program was ended permanently. Abaddon then ordered the destruction of Horus's body itself, the physical remains that various factions had been fighting over since the retreat from Terra. The burning of Horus's corpse took place in a ritual that Abaddon designed to mark the end of the Sons of Horus and the beginning of something new. The body was placed on a pyre constructed from the wreckage of ships that had fought at Terra, surrounded by the banners and honors the Legion had earned during the Great Crusade. Abaddon addressed the assembled warriors, explaining that Horus was dead and that no amount of cloning or ritual could bring him back. The Warmaster's legacy wasn't his body or his genetic material, it was the warriors he had led and the vision he had pursued. The Sons of Horus had failed at Terra, but the war against the Imperium wasn't finished. What was needed now wasn't loyalty to a dead Primarch, but commitment to the long war that would eventually tear down the Imperium the Emperor had built. The transformation into the Black Legion began with the rejection of the Sons of Horus name and iconography. Abaddon ordered his warriors to repaint their armor, replacing the sea green and black of the Sons of Horus with pure black that would mark them as something new. The Eye of Horus that had adorned their shoulder plates was retained but recontextualized, It no longer represented their Primarch's watchfulness, but the all-seeing hatred they would direct against the Imperium. The change was more than cosmetic. It represented a fundamental shift in the Legion's identity from being defined by their relationship to Horus to being defined by their commitment to the Long War. Abaddon's vision for the Black Legion emphasized unity among all traitor forces rather than the factional divisions that had weakened them since Horus's death. The new Legion would accept warriors from any of the traitor legions, from renegade chapters, from any space marine who rejected the Imperium and was willing to fight in the Long War. This approach was radical. The legions had always maintained their distinct identities and had resisted integration even when fighting as allies. Abaddon argued that this attachment to legion identity was a weakness that the Imperium could exploit, that the traitor forces needed to unite under a single banner if they were going to pose a genuine threat to the Imperium rather than just being a persistent nuisance. The implementation of this vision required Abaddon to demonstrate that the Black Legion could accomplish what the fractured traitor forces couldn't achieve individually. He led the newly renamed Legion in a series of raids and campaigns that targeted Imperial assets with the kind of coordination and strategic thinking that had been absent since Horus's death. Black Legion forces struck at Forge Worlds, captured ships and equipment that could sustain their operations, and demonstrated that united action could achieve results that individual warbands couldn't match. Warriors from other traitor legions, who had been fighting pointless conflicts in the Legion Wars, saw the Black Legion's success and began to consider whether Abaddon's vision might offer them better prospects than their current situations. The process of building the Black Legion into a force that could unite the traitor factions took decades and required Abaddon to prove himself repeatedly to warriors who had no reason to trust anyone after years of betrayals and failed leadership. The first captain, now styling himself the Warmaster in recognition of his role as Horus's successor, conducted the Black Crusades that would define his legacy and demonstrate that the Long War was more than just rhetoric. Each crusade struck deep into Imperial space, threatened critical systems, and forced the Imperium to divert resources to contain threats that Abaddon had created. The Black Legion became the largest and most dangerous of the traitor forces, its ranks swelling with warriors who recognized that Abaddon offered them purpose and direction that they couldn't find elsewhere. The Black Legion's relationship with the Chaos Gods differed from how the Sons of Horus had approached their corruption. Abaddon refused to pledge himself to any single Chaos power, maintaining independence that allowed him to draw on all four ruinous powers without becoming a slave to any of them. This approach was risky. The Chaos Gods didn't appreciate being used as tools rather than worshipped as divine entities, but it allowed Abaddon to avoid the fate that had consumed Horus. The Warmaster had become a puppet of the Chaos Gods, empowered by them, but ultimately serving their purposes rather than his own. Abaddon was determined to use chaos without being used by it, to remain in control of his own destiny, even while drawing on powers that had destroyed his Primarch. The fragmentation of the Sons of Horus into dozens of competing warbands began during the chaotic retreat from Terra and accelerated through the Scouring as the Legion's command structure collapsed. While Abaddon succeeded in gathering the largest single concentration of former Sons of Horus warriors under the Black Legion banner, thousands of others rejected his authority or simply never received his summons. These scattered elements formed their own warbands, each claiming to represent the true legacy of the 16th Legion, even as they pursued divergent goals and adopted conflicting interpretations of what that legacy meant. The Eye of Terror became home to most of these splinter groups, the demon worlds and warp storms providing refuge from Imperial pursuit, while exposing the refugees to corrupting influences that accelerated their transformation into something far removed from the warriors who had followed Horus during the Great Crusade. The True Sons emerged as one of the most significant splinter groups, composed primarily of officers and warriors who had served in the Legion's command elements during the Heresy. These veterans rejected Abaddon's claim to lead the 16th Legion's successors, arguing that his destruction of Horus's body and his abandonment of the Sons of Horus name constituted betrayal of everything their Primarch had fought for. The true sons maintained the sea green and black color scheme that the Sons of Horus had adopted after Davin, wore the Eye of Horus on their shoulder plates as a mark of their continued loyalty to their gene sire, and structured their warband to mirror the Legion's organization during its height. Their leadership consisted of former captains who had commanded companies during the Siege of Terra, warriors whose authority derived from having fought beside Horus himself, rather than from any post-heresy accomplishments. The True Sons' operations focused on recovering artifacts and relics connected to Horus and the Legion's history. They raided Imperial museums and archives seeking records of the Great Crusade, attacked Forge Worlds to recover weapons and equipment that had been manufactured for the 16th Legion, and even assaulted other traitor warbands to claim trophies and honors that had belonged to Sons of Horus warriors. This obsession with the past made them effective raiders when targeting specific objectives, but limited their strategic impact. The True Sons were more interested in preserving their Primarch's memory than in prosecuting the Long War effectively. Their numbers remained relatively small, perhaps a few thousand warriors scattered across multiple warbands that maintained loose coordination through shared ideology rather than unified command. The Wolves of Horus represented a different approach to preserving the Legion's legacy, one that emphasized the martial excellence and tactical doctrines the Sons of Horus had developed rather than fetishizing their history. The warband's leadership consisted of veterans who had served in line companies during the heresy, warriors whose expertise lay in conducting the kind of decisive strikes that had characterized the Legion's operations throughout the Great Crusade and the Rebellion. They retained elements of the Sons of Horus iconography, but modified it to reflect their evolution. The wolf's head that had marked Luna Wolf's armor reappeared on their shoulder plates, combined with the Eye of Horus to create a hybrid symbol that acknowledged both the Legion's origins and its transformation under their Primarch's command. The Wolves of Horus maintained discipline and tactical coordination that most other splinter warbands lacked. Their operations demonstrated the kind of planning and execution that had made the 16th Legion the Emperor's chosen instrument for critical campaigns. When they struck at Imperial targets, they identified strategic objectives and applied overwhelming force at decisive points, achieving their goals with efficiency that recalled the Legion's glory days. This effectiveness made them valuable allies for other traitor forces conducting major operations, and the Wolves of Horus frequently hired themselves out as mercenaries to warbands that needed skilled warriors for complex campaigns. The warband's numbers fluctuated as they recruited from other traitor forces and lost warriors to attrition, but they maintained a core strength of several thousand Astartes organized into companies that operated semi-independently while coordinating through a central command structure. The thrice-cursed traitors emerged from elements of the Legion that had been particularly heavily corrupted during the heresy, warriors whose mutations and demonic possession had progressed to the point where they could no longer function within conventional military structures. The warband consisted almost entirely of possessed Astartes, their bodies inhabited by demons that granted them supernatural capabilities, while stripping away most of their original personalities. The Thrice-Cursed operated more as a demonic host than a Space Marine warband, their attacks characterized by the kind of reality-warping violence that demons brought to combat, rather than the tactical sophistication the Sons of Horus had once demonstrated. They served chaos undivided rather than pledging to any specific god, drawing power from all four ruinous powers in patterns that shifted based on which entities currently dominated the warband's possessed warriors. The Sons of the Eye took their name from their base of operations in the Eye of Terror, and their continued use of Horus's Eye as their primary iconography. The warband specialized in void warfare and boarding actions, skills they had developed during the Beta Garmin campaign and refined through decades of piracy and raiding in the years since the heresy. Their fleet consisted of ships captured from Imperial and traitor forces alike, vessels that had been modified extensively to accommodate the mutations spreading through the warband's ranks, and to incorporate dark mechanicum innovations that conventional mechanicum doctrine would reject. The Sons of the Eye conducted operations throughout the Eye of Terror and the surrounding regions, attacking convoys, raiding isolated systems, and occasionally participating in larger campaigns when other traitor forces offered sufficient compensation or the strategic situation aligned with their interests. The theological and ideological divisions among the splinter warbands reflected the fundamental question of what the Sons of Horus had been fighting for and what their successors should pursue. Some warbands embraced dedicated worship of specific chaos gods, arguing that Horus's failure at Terra had resulted from his attempt to balance the competing demands of all four ruinous powers rather than committing fully to one patron. These god-dedicated warbands adopted the marks and mutations associated with their chosen deities, their warriors transforming into Khorne berserkers, plague marines, noise marines, or rubric marines depending on which power they served. The transformation often involved rejecting significant portions of the Sons of Horus tactical doctrines in favor of combat styles that aligned with their patrons' preferences. Khorne-dedicated warbands abandoned the careful planning that had characterized the Legion's operations in favor of direct assault, while Slaanesh-devoted warriors pursued perfection in specific combat techniques at the expense of tactical flexibility. Other warbands maintained the pragmatic approach to chaos that Horus himself had demonstrated before his final corruption, viewing the ruinous powers as tools to be exploited rather than gods to be worshipped. These pragmatist warbands drew on chaos when it served their purposes, but avoided the kind of total commitment that led to transformation into cult marines. They retained more of the Sons of Horus tactical sophistication, applying enhanced capabilities gained through limited chaos corruption to execute operations that required planning and coordination rather than just overwhelming force. The pragmatist approach carried risks. The chaos gods didn't appreciate being treated as tools and sometimes withdrew their support at critical moments or actively sabotaged operations conducted by warriors who refused to worship them properly. But it also allowed these warbands to maintain the flexibility and independence that dedicated worship would have cost them. The conflicts between god-dedicated and pragmatist warbands consumed significant resources and warriors that could have been directed against the Imperium. Khorne-dedicated warbands attacked pragmatist groups they viewed as cowards for refusing to commit fully to the blood god's service. Tzeentch-devoted sorcerers manipulated pragmatist warbands into conflicts that served the changer of Wei's incomprehensible schemes. Nurgle's followers spread plagues through pragmatist strongholds, viewing the infections as gifts that would bring their brothers into the plague god's embrace. These internal conflicts mirrored the broader Legion wars that consumed the traitor forces during the Scouring, preventing the Sons of Horus successor warbands from uniting against their common enemy, even when strategic logic suggested cooperation would serve their interests better than continued infighting. The Black Legion's dominance as the true inheritors of the 16th Legion's legacy rested on Abaddon's success in implementing the strategic vision that Horus had developed but never fully realized. The Warmaster had recognized during the heresy that the traitor forces needed unity to defeat the Imperium, that the factional divisions and competing loyalties weakening their coalition would eventually doom the rebellion if they couldn't be overcome. Horus had attempted to maintain that unity through personal relationships with his brother Primarchs, and through the command authority the Emperor had granted him, but his corruption and eventual death had shattered the coalition before it could be fully consolidated. Abaddon learned from his Gene Sire's failure, building the Black Legion on foundations that didn't depend on a single charismatic leader, or on maintaining the fiction that the traitor forces shared common goals beyond destroying the Imperium. The Black Legion's recruitment practices drew on all the traitor legions and renegade chapters, creating a force whose diversity became a source of strength rather than weakness. Warriors who joined the Black Legion brought with them the tactical doctrines and combat techniques of their original legions, expanding the Black Legion's capabilities beyond what any single legion could have achieved. Former World Eaters provided expertise in close assault and shock tactics. Ex-Emperor's children contributed knowledge of precision strikes and the pursuit of perfection in specific combat roles. Death Guard veterans brought their experience with attrition warfare and resilience in the face of horrific casualties. Night Lords added skills in terror tactics and unconventional operations. This integration required careful management to prevent the factional conflicts that had plagued the traitor forces during the heresy. But Abaddon's leadership and the Black Legion's emphasis on merit over lineage created an environment where warriors from different backgrounds could work together effectively. The tactical doctrines the Black Legion inherited from the Sons of Horus emphasized identifying critical objectives and applying overwhelming force at decisive points, but these core principles were adapted and expanded through the integration of techniques from other legions. Black Legion operations combined the Sons of Horus preference for decisive strikes with World Eater's aggression, Emperor's Children precision, and Alpha Legion misdirection. This synthesis created a force that could adapt to diverse tactical situations more effectively than warbands that relied on single approaches to warfare. When the Black Legion deployed, they brought capabilities that allowed them to execute complex operations requiring coordination across multiple combat specialties, something most other traitor warbands couldn't match. The Black Legion's role in the Long War extended beyond simple raiding and piracy to strategic operations designed to weaken the Imperium's foundations. Abaddon recognized that the traitor forces couldn't defeat the Imperium through direct military confrontation. The Imperium was too large, controlled too many resources, and could replace losses faster than the traitors could inflict them. Instead, the Long War required patient degradation of Imperial capabilities, striking at critical infrastructure and eliminating key personnel, while avoiding decisive battles that would allow the Imperium to bring its full strength to bear. The Black Crusades that Abaddon launched periodically represented concentrated efforts to achieve strategic objectives that would weaken the Imperium's ability to resist future operations, each crusade building on the accomplishments of previous campaigns to create cumulative damage that the Imperium struggled to repair. The Black Legion's approach to chaos worship followed Abaddon's example of drawing on all four ruinous powers without pledging to any single god. This policy created tensions with god-dedicated warbands who viewed the Black Legion's pragmatism as heresy against their patrons, but it also allowed the Black Legion to recruit from all factions and to adapt their tactics based on which chaos powers offered the most useful support for specific operations. Black Legion sorcerers learned to invoke different aspects of chaos depending on tactical requirements, summoning Cornate demons when they needed shock assault capabilities, calling on Nurgle's plagues when they wanted to weaken fortified positions, drawing on Tzeentch's powers for reality manipulation, and invoking Slaanesh when they required enhanced speed and precision. This flexibility made the Black Legion more dangerous than warbands that could only draw on single chaos powers, though it also meant they never received the full blessings that dedicated worship might have granted. The various splinter warbands that emerged during and after Black Crusades represented both the Black Legion's success in mobilizing traitor forces and the persistent fragmentation that weakened those forces. Each Black Crusade gathered thousands of warriors under Abaddon's banner, combining Black Legion core forces with contingents from dozens of other warbands and traitor factions. These coalitions achieved objectives that individual warbands couldn't have accomplished, penetrating deep into Imperial space and threatening critical systems before Imperial responses could organize effective resistance. But when each crusade concluded, many of the warbands that had participated splintered off to pursue their own agendas, taking with them equipment and experience gained during the crusade, but refusing to maintain the unity that had made their success possible. Abaddon accepted this pattern as inevitable, recognizing that the traitor force's independence and factional divisions couldn't be eliminated entirely, but could be channeled toward productive purposes during the periods when Black Crusades provided common cause. The emergence of new warbands claiming Sons of Horus heritage continued into the 41st millennium as warriors who had never served in the original Legion adopted its iconography and tactical doctrines. These successor groups lacked direct connection to Horus or the Heresy-era Legion, but they embraced the Sons of Horus identity because it carried prestige and suggested capabilities that generic traitor warbands couldn't claim. Some of these successors were founded by Black Legion veterans who left Abaddon's service to establish their own forces, bringing with them genuine knowledge of Sons of Horus tactics and traditions. Others were simply opportunists who adopted the name and symbols without understanding what they represented, creating confusion about which warbands genuinely descended from the 16th Legion and which were pretenders trading on a legacy they hadn't earned. The impact of the Sons of Horus legacy on the broader traitor cause extended beyond the specific warbands that claimed direct descent from the 16th Legion. The tactical doctrines the Sons of Horus had developed influenced how all traitor forces approached warfare, their emphasis on decisive strikes and overwhelming force at critical points becoming standard practice across multiple warbands and traitor legions. The warrior lodge system that had helped corrupt the Legion during the heresy's early stages provided a model for how traitor forces organized themselves outside formal military hierarchies, creating networks of personal loyalty that cut across unit boundaries and allowed coordination that rigid command structures couldn't achieve. Even the mistakes the Sons of Horus had made, their over-reliance on Horus's leadership, their failure to maintain unity after his death, their descent into factional conflicts during the Scouring, provided lessons that other traitor forces studied and attempted to avoid in their own operations. The gene seed harvested from the Sons of Horus presents unique challenges and opportunities for warbands operating in the 41st millennium. The biological legacy Horus left his sons was already unstable before the heresy began. The accelerated implantation processes used during the Great Crusade's expansion having introduced subtle flaws that manifested more severely as the Legion embraced chaos corruption. By the current era, 10,000 years of exposure to warp energies and the accumulated mutations passed through successive generations of implantation have transformed the gene seed into something that bears only superficial resemblance to what the Emperor's geneticists originally created. The progenitor glands harvested from fallen warriors often contain genetic material so corrupted that implantation carries significant risks even by the standards of Chaos Space Marines, who generally accept mutation rates that would be catastrophic for Loyalist chapters. The instability manifests in several distinct patterns that apothecaries working with Sons of Horus gene seed have learned to recognize and, in some cases, exploit. The Becher's gland, which in uncorrupted Astartes produces acidic saliva, frequently mutates to generate substances far more corrosive and unpredictable. Some warriors develop the ability to spit streams of acid that can eat through ceramite armor plate, while others find their saliva becomes a contact poison that induces paralysis or hallucinations in victims. The mutations are rarely consistent even within the same warband, making it impossible to predict what capabilities any individual warrior might develop. The Laraman's organ, responsible for rapid blood clotting, often evolves into something that causes flesh to regenerate at unnatural rates, healing wounds that should be fatal, but also producing tumorous growths that must be surgically removed before they compromise the warrior's combat effectiveness. The catalepsian node, which allows Space Marines to rest portions of their brain while remaining alert, frequently becomes corrupted in ways that blur the line between waking consciousness and dreams. Warriors with compromised catalepsian nodes report experiencing visions that might be warp-based premonitions or might simply be hallucinations produced by malfunctioning neural tissue. Some warbands view these visions as gifts from the Chaos Gods and incorporate them into their tactical planning, while others treat them as disabilities to be managed through careful monitoring and intervention when affected warriors begin acting on information that has no basis in reality. The oculobe, which enhances visual perception, sometimes mutates to allow warriors to perceive wavelengths beyond the normal spectrum, or even to see partially into the warp itself, granting advantages in detecting demons and psychers, but also exposing the affected warriors to images that can drive them insane. The dark gifts manifested in modern Sons of Horus descendants vary based on which chaos powers have influenced their corruption and how individual warriors have responded to warp exposure. Warriors who have spent extensive time in the Eye of Terror often develop mutations that reflect the specific demon worlds they have inhabited or the rituals they have participated in. Those based on Forge worlds corrupted by the Dark Mechanicum might show integration of mechanical components into their flesh, their bodies becoming hybrid organisms that combine Astartes biology with technology that shouldn't be able to interface with living tissue. Others develop more overtly demonic characteristics, additional limbs that sprout from their torsos, sensory organs that appear in anatomically impossible locations, or skin that takes on textures and colors that have no equivalent in natural biology. The possession rates among Sons of Horus descendants remain higher than in most other Traitor Legion successors, a legacy of the Warrior Lodge system that made the original Legion particularly vulnerable to demonic influence. The lodges created social structures that encouraged warriors to lower their psychological defenses and accept influences they might otherwise have resisted, and those patterns persisted even after the formal lodge system collapsed during the Scouring. Modern warbands descended from the Sons of Horus often include significant numbers of possessed warriors who have allowed demons to inhabit their bodies, viewing possession as a source of power rather than a corruption to be avoided. The possessed serve as shock troops in assaults where their supernatural resilience and enhanced strength provide decisive advantages, though their instability and the risk that their demonic passengers might pursue agendas contrary to the warband's objectives means they require careful management. The tactical doctrines preserved from the Great Crusade remain influential in how Sons of Horus descendants approach warfare, though 10 millennia of evolution and adaptation have modified the original principles significantly. The emphasis on identifying critical objectives and applying overwhelming force at decisive points continues to characterize operations conducted by warbands that maintain connection to the Legion's heritage. When these forces deploy against Imperial targets, they conduct reconnaissance to identify command centers, communication nodes, and other facilities whose destruction or capture will cause disproportionate damage to enemy capabilities. The spearhead assault that the Luna Wolves developed during the Great Crusade's early years remains the preferred tactical approach, with elite units penetrating enemy defenses to strike at vulnerable points while supporting forces exploit the breaches created. The combined arms warfare that characterized the Sons of Horus during their height has been adapted to incorporate the demonic allies and warp-based capabilities that modern warbands can access. Conventional Space Marine tactics emphasized coordination between infantry, armor, and air support, with each element contributing to operations according to its strengths. Modern Sons of Horus descendants add additional layers to this framework, integrating possessed warriors who serve as shock troops, sorcerers who provide warp-based fire support and reality manipulation, and summoned demons who can appear directly in enemy rear areas or fortified positions. The coordination required to manage these diverse elements exceeds what the original Legion dealt with, as demonic allies don't follow orders with the reliability of conventional military units, and warp-based powers can produce unpredictable results that disrupt carefully planned operations. The integration of demonic allies into tactical operations requires specialists who understand both conventional military doctrine and the nature of warp entities. Most warbands maintain cadres of sorcerers who have studied the rituals necessary to summon specific types of demons, and who can predict with reasonable accuracy how those entities will behave once manifested. The sorcerers work with conventional officers to plan operations that exploit demonic capabilities while minimizing the risks that come with inviting warp entities into real space. A typical assault might begin with sorcerers summoning bloodletters into an enemy command center, creating chaos that disrupts defensive coordination, while conventional forces advance on the exterior defenses. The demons serve as force multipliers that allow smaller numbers of Chaos Space Marines to achieve objectives that would otherwise require significantly larger forces, though the unpredictability inherent in working with warp entities means that operations can go catastrophically wrong when demons pursue their own agendas rather than supporting the warband's objectives. Recruitment and initiation practices in the Eye of Terror reflect both the practical constraints of operating in a region where reality functions inconsistently and the cultural preferences inherited from the original Legion. The Sons of Horus had always preferred recruits drawn from hive gang cultures, warriors who understood loyalty as personal bonds rather than abstract obligations to institutions. This preference persists among their descendants, who raid Imperial hive worlds to capture adolescents with the physical characteristics and psychological profiles suitable for transformation into Chaos Space Marines. The raids target the underhive population specifically, as these individuals have already been hardened by lives spent in environments where violence and betrayal are constants. A youth who has survived gang warfare in an underhive possesses the mental resilience and capacity for violence that the transformation process requires, along with an understanding of loyalty structures that aligns well with how Chaos Warbands organize themselves. The trials of ascension that aspirants undergo have evolved far beyond what the original Legion practiced during the Great Crusade. Where the Luna Wolves tested recruits through combat trials and evaluations of their ability to work within squad structures, modern warbands expose aspirants to challenges that incorporate warp-based elements designed to identify those with the psychological strength to survive corruption without losing their utility as warriors. Aspirants might be locked in chambers where reality fluctuates unpredictably, forcing them to maintain their sanity while experiencing phenomena that violate everything they understand about how the universe functions. Others face trials where they must resist demonic possession attempts, demonstrating that they can interact with warp entities without being consumed by them. The mortality rate during these trials exceeds what the original Legion accepted, but the warbands operating in the Eye of Terror have access to larger populations of potential recruits than the Great Crusade-era Legion could draw on, making the waste of aspirants a cost they can afford. The role of possession in the recruitment process varies significantly between warbands based on their theological positions and practical requirements. Some groups view possession as the ultimate test of an aspirant's worth, deliberately exposing candidates to demonic entities and observing how they respond. Aspirants who successfully resist possession demonstrate psychological strength that makes them valuable as conventional warriors, while those who accept demons into their bodies become possessed Chaos Space Marines who serve different tactical roles. Other warbands treat possession as a corruption to be avoided during the recruitment phase, preferring to transform aspirants into conventional Chaos Space Marines before exposing them to situations where possession might occur. These warbands argue that warriors need to develop the skills and discipline of proper Astartes before they can safely interact with demonic entities, and that allowing possession too early in a warrior's development wastes the resources invested in his transformation. The implantation of gene seed into aspirants who survive the trials follows procedures that would horrify loyalist apothecaries, but that have been refined through 10,000 years of practice by traitor forces. The corrupted gene seed requires modified implantation techniques that account for the mutations and instabilities inherent in the biological material. Apothecaries working with Sons of Horus gene seed have developed protocols for identifying which organs are likely to develop problematic mutations, and for intervening surgically when those mutations threaten to compromise the aspirant's viability. The process is inefficient by the standards the Emperor's geneticists would have demanded, with significant numbers of aspirants dying or being rendered useless during implantation, but it produces warriors who combine Astartes' capabilities with the enhancements that Chaos corruption provides. The place of Sons of Horus descendants in contemporary conflicts reflects their evolution from a unified legion into dozens of competing warbands with divergent agendas and capabilities. The largest concentration of former Sons of Horus warriors operates under the Black Legion banner, their numbers supplemented by recruits from other traitor legions and renegade chapters who have accepted Abaddon's authority. These forces participate in the major campaigns that define the Long War's progression, serving as core elements in Black Crusades and other strategic operations designed to weaken the Imperium's ability to resist traitor advances. When the 13th Black Crusade smashed into the Cadian Gate, Black Legion forces that traced their lineage to the Sons of Horus formed significant portions of the assault elements that broke through the fortress world's defenses and allowed the broader traitor coalition to pour into the Imperium's territory. The opening of the Cicatrix Maledictum transformed the strategic situation in ways that provided both opportunities and challenges for Sons of Horus descendants. The massive warp rift that split the Imperium in half created new routes for traitor forces to penetrate into Imperial space, bypassing defensive networks that had contained them for millennia. Warbands that had been trapped in the Eye of Terror or other isolated regions suddenly found themselves able to raid systems that had been secure since the heresy ended. The Cicatrix also exposed vast populations to warp corruption, creating recruitment opportunities as planetary governments collapsed and populations descended into the kind of hive gang warfare that produced ideal candidates for transformation into Chaos Space Marines. Sons of Horus descendants exploited these opportunities aggressively, conducting raids throughout the Imperium nihilist to capture aspirants and resources, while the Imperial defensive response remained disorganized. The Indomitus Crusade's launch represented the Imperium's attempt to restore order and push back the traitor advances that had followed the Cicatrix's opening. The Crusade brought together massive Imperial forces, including the new Primaris Space Marines, whose enhanced capabilities and fresh gene seed made them formidable opponents for traitor forces that had been wearing down through millennia of attrition. Sons of Horus descendants encountered these Primaris Marines in battles throughout the Imperium Nihilus and found them to be dangerous adversaries whose resilience and firepower exceeded what conventional Space Marines could bring to combat. The tactical doctrines that had served well against standard Astartes required adaptation when facing enemies who combined superior equipment with the tactical flexibility that came from not being corrupted by 10,000 years of warp exposure. The role of Sons of Horus descendants as both independent raiders and Black Legion auxiliaries creates complex dynamics in how these forces operate. Warbands that maintain independence from the Black Legion conduct their own campaigns according to their leaders' priorities, raiding Imperial systems for resources and recruits while avoiding commitments that would subordinate them to Abaddon's strategic vision. These independent operators provide flexibility that the more structured Black Legion forces sometimes lack, able to exploit opportunities that arise suddenly without requiring approval from higher command levels. When circumstances align their interests with Black Legion objectives, independent warbands coordinate their operations with Abaddon's forces, providing specialized capabilities or simply adding numbers to assaults that require overwhelming force. The relationship remains transactional rather than hierarchical, with independent warbands maintaining the option to withdraw from operations if they judge the costs exceed the benefits. The Black Legion auxiliaries drawn from Sons of Horus descendants operate under more formal command structures that integrate them into the broader Black Legion organization while preserving some autonomy in how they execute assigned missions. These auxiliaries provide the Black Legion with units that understand the tactical heritage of the 16th Legion and can execute operations using doctrines that Abaddon and other former Sons of Horus officers developed during the Great Crusade and Heresy. When the Black Legion conducts major campaigns, these auxiliary forces serve in roles that exploit their specializations, spearhead assaults that require decisive strikes at critical objectives, boarding actions against enemy fleets, operations that demand the kind of coordinated combined arms warfare that the Sons of Horus perfected during their height. The auxiliaries receive priority access to resources and equipment that the Black Legion controls, compensation for accepting the constraints that come with operating under Abaddon's authority rather than maintaining complete independence. The conflicts between different Sons of Horus successor warbands continue to consume resources and warriors that could theoretically be directed against the Imperium, though the intensity of these internal struggles has diminished somewhat as the Long War has progressed. The theological disputes that drove much of the violence during the Scouring have been largely resolved through the simple expedient of physical separation. Warbands that worship specific chaos gods operate in different regions and pursue different objectives than pragmatist groups that maintain the balanced approach to chaos that Abaddon advocates. When conflicts do occur, they tend to result from competition over specific resources or territories, rather than from fundamental disagreements about how to prosecute the Long War. A warband that has established a base on a demon world might find itself fighting other Sons of Horus descendants who want to claim that territory, but the violence serves practical purposes rather than being driven by ideological purity. The legacy of the Sons of Horus in the 41st millennium extends beyond the specific warbands that claim direct descent from the 16th Legion to influence how the broader traitor cause approaches warfare and organization. The tactical doctrines they developed remain standard practice across multiple traitor forces, their emphasis on decisive strikes and overwhelming force at critical points having proven effective enough that even warbands with no connection to the Sons of Horus adopt similar approaches. The warrior lodge system that helped corrupt the Legion during the Heresy's early stages provided organizational models that other traitor forces copied, creating networks of personal loyalty that allow coordination outside formal command structures. Even the failures and mistakes that characterize the Sons of Horus's history offer lessons that inform how modern traitor forces organize themselves and conduct operations. As the Long War grinds into its 11th millennium, the Sons of Horus exist as fragments of what was once the Imperium's finest legion, their warriors scattered across dozens of warbands that pursue divergent agendas while drawing on a shared heritage of tactical excellence and bitter betrayal. They remain among the most dangerous threats the Imperium faces, their corruption and experience making them formidable opponents even for the enhanced forces the Imperium has deployed to counter them. The Eye of Horus that marks their armor serves as a reminder of the Warmaster who led the greatest rebellion in human history, a symbol of ambition and betrayal that continues to inspire those who reject the Emperor's vision. Whether serving under the Black Legion banner or operating as independent raiders, the descendants of the 16th Legion prosecute the Long War with skills inherited from warriors who once stood at the Emperor's side, their expertise now turned against the Imperium they were created to build and defend. The war that began at Isstvan continues across a galaxy torn by the cicatrix maledictum, and the Sons of Horus remain committed to the vision their Primarch died pursuing, the destruction of the Imperium and everything it represents.